Chapter 1. After an unknown period of time, Han Shaw opened his sore eyes. His whole body ached terribly, and his brain hurt even more. It was as if he had a severe migraine, and his brain seemed to be filled with a mess of things. He looked around. The surroundings were dusky. Piles of ghastly white bones were scattered messily in all directions. In the distance, there were some strange black substances that emitted a strong stench that made people want to vomit. Sigh, I'm really dead. This must be the underworld. Han Shaw's heart was like dead ashes. He thought to himself, I'm really unlucky to have died at such a young age. I was crippled in my previous life. I should quickly reincarnate and try to be different in my next life. Just as Han Shaw was thinking about this, his brain suddenly hurt terribly. After holding his headache and crying for a while, he felt as if he had learned a lot of things. Brian. Brian, who is Brian? Half an hour later, Han Shaw was dumbfounded. He thought to himself, how could such a bizarre thing as reincarnation happen to me? Moreover, I actually reincarnate into a foreigner's body. What kind of magic did that old lunatic Chu Kanglan do? Did he make a mistake? Han Shaw's eyes had slowly adapted to the darkness. He moved his limbs and brought his right arm in front of his eyes to take a look. The black mole on his wrist was gone. What was left were hideous scars that looked like earthworms wriggling on his arm. It made Han Shaw shudder with just a glance. This body wasn't his. Han Shaw was dumbfounded. Then, he realized that he had really reincarnated in another person's body. Although Brian was dead, Han Shaw didn't know why, but he actually knew about Brian's past. Then, Han Shaw knew that not only had he reincarnated in another person's body, but he hadn't reincarnated in America, England, or any other Western country. In a strange world called the Profound Continent, in a strange country called the Lancelot Empire. This was a bizarre continent where swords, magic, and alien races ran rampant. Brian's parents died when he was young, and when he was only 10, he was sold by his uncle to a slave trader. The slave trader then sold Brian to the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. Brian's life was filled with darkness from then on. Brian had been 16 years old before his death. He'd been assigned to the weakest necromancy major in the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force, an errand boy. Over the past 6 years, his job had been to help necromancy students move the skeletons, zombies, and other waste products from failed necromancy magic experiments into this graveyard. In addition to this main job, he was also in charge of making tea, pouring water, sweeping the floor, and getting rid of insects. Also, the necromancy students would use him to test the combat abilities of skeletons or ghouls, or experiment with necromancy spells on him. The cowardly Brian had lived a life worse than death in these 6 years. His entire body was riddled with scars. Eating the disgusting bread and doing endless things, the necromancy students would always find Brian to practice their skills whenever they lost a magic competition with other mages. A 16-year-old youth, 6 years of torture. What kind of cruel treatment was this for a child? There were many times when Brian wanted to end his life by committing suicide, but his cowardly self didn't even have the courage to do so. Just like that, he endured the pain in silence for 6 years. Finally, the day before yesterday, his soul was invaded by a vengeful spirit summoned by the little witch of the necromancy major, Lisa, and he died. At the moment of his death, Brian didn't feel a trace of pain. He only felt the joy of being freed from the pain of his heart. Brian had been moving corpses and broken skeletons for 6 years. In the end, he was also thrown into a grave by another odd-job worker, the one that he often threw into the same place as trash. Han Shaw had already felt that his life had been dark enough, but when compared to Brian, Han Shaw suddenly felt a lump in his throat. For the first time, he thought that he'd been very happy all these years. After understanding Brian's past, Han Shaw felt a lump in his throat. His voice choked with emotion as he sighed, how can there be such a foolish and cowardly youth in this world? Brian, I've taken over your body. What should I do for you? Han Shaw suddenly felt a trace of something like liquid in his body. At this moment, Han Shaw felt a pain in his head as some memory fragments suddenly appeared. The trace of liquid slowly flowed around Han Shaw's body. At this moment, Han Shuro became a bit sluggish as his mind passively learned many things from the inexplicable old psycho Chu Kanglan. There were 9 levels of demonic cultivation: solid, meridian opening, mold spirit, true demon, bloodlust, separate demon, carnal, 9 changes, and omen. Demonic practitioners were bloodthirsty and could do whatever they wanted. They didn't care about any morals or laws, and pursued absolute strength. Once they became demonic, they would possess the peerless ability to move mountains and drain seas. After sitting for who knew how long, Han Shuro learned many things that he'd never imagined in the past. Moreover, Han Shuro was sure that something must have gone wrong with Chu Kanglan's last magic trick. Chu Kanglan's own soul was gone, but he had left behind all the memories of that demonic cultivation technique. That trace of something flowing in his body should be the most basic and important demonic yuan, the foundation of all demonic cultivation techniques. According to Chu Kanglan's memories, it would take at least 3 to 5 years for a demonic cultivator to condense demonic yuan. However, Han Shuro didn't know anything about it and didn't do anything. However, there was a trace of demonic yuan in his body. Although it was pitifully weak, Han Shuro knew that it was indeed demonic yuan. Han Shuro thought to himself, Chu Kanglan, that old psycho, although he wanted me to be his scapegoat, he didn't expect that he would send me to such an unfamiliar time and space. The messy demonic cultivation techniques in his head must have been left behind by Chu Kanglan before he died. Although Han Shuro knew a little about this unfamiliar world through poor Brian was only a cowardly errand slave of the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. His knowledge was very limited. Han Shuro began to let his imagination run wild for the rest of his life. Brian was dead, and Han Shuro had taken over his body. Han Shuro was Brian now, and Brian had been sold to the Academy of Magic and Force. This was an eternal mark of identity. In this unfamiliar world, the punishment for slaves who ran away was cruel and terrifying. Therefore, Han Shuro couldn't run, and he might not be able to. Moreover, Han Shuro had no money, not even a copper coin. After careful consideration for a long time, Han Shuro finally decided to return to the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. That was the only place where he could change his identity as a slave, and also do something for the poor dead Brian. Han Shuro's entire body was in excruciating pain. Brian still had many old injuries when he was alive. He was just about to stand up when he felt his entire body aching. He couldn't help but cry out loudly and sit down on his butt. Han Shuro didn't have a single good impression of Chu Kanglan, who had forcefully taken him away. The world that Chu Kanglan lived in was also foreign to Han Shuro. However, from the memories that Chu Kanglan had left behind, Han Shuro knew that practicing demonic arts could strengthen one's body from the start. Towards the end, one could even fly in the sky and move mountains and drain the seas. There was nothing one couldn't do. Although Han Shuro felt that Chu Kanglan was a little crazy, just the fact that he could fly directly to the moon with Han Shuro was enough for Han Shuro to vaguely believe that the description of flying in the sky and earth in the demonic arts was true. There was a weak trace of magical yuan in Han Shuro's body. He held the thought of giving it a try in order to increase his chances of survival. Han Shuro recalled the difficult incantations of the demonic arts and began to focus his mental strength as hard as he could according to the first solid incantation. He wanted to control that weak trace of magical yuan. Han Shuro focused his mind and began to control that weak strand of magical yuan according to the solid incantation. As a result, he found that the weak strand of magical yuan was just as Chu Kanglan had said: wherever the mind wanted, the magical yuan would go. Delighted, Han Shuro thought to himself that although Chu Kanglan seemed a little crazy, he didn't expect that the demonic arts he had left behind would actually have some effect. Thinking of this, he began to focus his mind and began to circulate that weak strand of magical yuan in his body according to the solid incantation. When Han Shuro's stomach growled, he woke up from his cultivation. He didn't know how long he had been cultivating, but Han Shuro felt that the pain in his body had lessened significantly, and his body had regained some strength. He had only been cultivating for a short while, and there were already such results. Who knew how long that crazy old Chu Kanglan had been cultivating? No wonder he had dared to go to the moon. Han Shuro could imagine how strong he had been when he was still alive. As soon as he stopped cultivating, Han Shaw noticed something strange, that strand of magical yuan no longer circulated according to the solid incantations rules when Han Shaw stopped cultivating. Instead, it wandered through Han Shaw's flesh, bones, hands, feet, head, and every part of his body. The first solid realm was a kind of forging of the body. It was a process of strengthening the muscles, skin, and bones. In this solid realm, in addition to slowly refining magical yuan, some perverted masters who were obsessed with demonic arts would also use all sorts of methods to constantly beat their bodies, causing them to be constantly damaged and then tempered with magical yuan. Only by working both inside and outside of the body could one cultivate faster. This demonic cultivation method is simply self-torture. But Brian has always been doing this. Perhaps I'll be able to cultivate the solid realm even faster when I return to the academy. It looks like being Brian isn't without its benefit. Han Shaw sighed inwardly and decided to leave this place first. When he thought of this, Han Shaw suddenly felt that he was an idiot for staying in this tomb all this time. He couldn't bear the stench any longer. The dim light came from above. According to Brian's memories, Han Shaw knew that there was a large hole above where broken bones and skeletons had been tossed. He felt sore all over as he stood up, his body riddled with scars. 6 years of torture had long since weakened Brian's body. He had also been eating poor quality food, so it was only natural that he was all skin and bones. He was also only 1.6 meters tall. Stepping on the moss, Han Shaw dragged his frail body up with all his might. After climbing for a while and falling 5 or 6 times, Han Shaw finally crawled out of the tomb. When he saw the full moon illuminating the earth and the silver splendor of the cemetery, Han Shaw felt the joy of being reborn as a human from the bottom of his heart. Feeling the magical essence still roaming through his body, Han Shaw comforted himself that he would definitely have good fortune after surviving this calamity. Moreover, he still had something to rely on this time. The secret demonic cultivation method that Chu Kanglan had left behind for him might be able to help him realize a dream that he had never dared to dream of in the past. But what Han Shaw didn't know was that the trace of magical essence that Chu Kanglan had left in his body not only helped him solidify, but was also a seed. As this seed changed his body, it also changed many of his thoughts. His mind had been filled with evil thoughts that he hadn't dared to carry out before, but this seed of evil now made it so that he couldn't control himself even if he wanted to. Chapter 2. Lancelot Empire's Babylon Academy of Magic and Force occupied an extremely large area and was renowned within the Empire. It was the most important nurturing ground for the Empire's mags and knights. The School of Magic was divided into the light, dark, fire, water, wind, earth, thunder, summoning, and space mages. Each major had its own school building, library, laboratory, training field, and living quarters. The entire academy was like a small city. The necromancy major that Brian was an errand boy belonged to the dark major. Because the necromancy major had to deal with dark creatures such as skeletons and zombies, in addition to the fact that necromancy magic had been on the decline for many years, the necromancy major was not only the least popular among the other majors, but it was also the weakest. Even the other students of the dark major looked down on the necromancy major and disdained to be associated with the students of the necromancy major. During his 6 years as an errand boy in the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force, Brian was in the weakest and most unpopular major. Add to that his special job, moving corpses and skeletons, and he had suffered endless disdain and humiliation. Not a single day went by that he didn't live in agony. Han Shaw followed Brian's memories and returned from the small path in the mountain behind the academy. It was a dark and windy night, and he returned from the small door used for errand boys. Because it was late at night, the students had all gone to bed early. Add to that the fact that the path Han Shaw took was quite remote. Han Shaw didn't run into anyone along the way. Han Shaw observed his surroundings along the way and discovered that the layout of the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force resembled the style of some Western European countries on Earth. After a while, Han Shaw finally returned to the necromancy major. Brian lived in a warehouse. This was completely in line with his errand boy status. The warehouse was filled with a messy assortment of items. Most of them were discarded junk or materials from experiments. Many of the items here were waiting to be disposed of, waiting for Brian to throw them away. The necromancy students would throw their unwanted items here through the windows, waiting for Brian to dispose of them. The hybrid library wasn't big to begin with. Other than some rubbish, there was only a small wooden bed. Even this small bed was filled with rubbish every day because the students didn't pay attention to it when they threw it. Brian worked until night every day. The first thing he did when he came back was to sort out the rubbish on his small bed. Early the next morning, he would throw away the rubbish that had to be dealt with before anyone woke up. When Hanshaw arrived at the hut and saw the junkyard warehouse, he felt a lump in his throat. He deeply sympathized with the poor boy. How did he get through these 6 years? The air in the hut was extremely foul. Even if the windows were opened, it would not be of much use. This was because the foul smell was emitted from the abandoned things. There was still a lot of rubbish on the small bed. It looked like even though Brian had died, others continued to throw rubbish here out of habit. Dragging his tired feet, Hanshaw found it difficult to take even a few steps. There was rubbish on the floor. He finally arrived at the small bed and planned to clean it up like Brian and have a good sleep. However, Hanshaw wasn't Brian after all. When he was halfway through cleaning, Hanshaw's heart rippled with anger. This anger was only sporadic at first, but the trace of magical energy in his body circulated rapidly when Hanshaw was angry, causing the anger in Hanshaw's heart to burn like a spark. Finally, Hanshaw abruptly stopped what he was doing and said fiercely, "I'm not Brian, I won't suffer like this. Brian, oh Brian, since I've taken over your body, let me help you punish that little witch Lisa." Hanshaw didn't know that according to his original personality, although he would have the intention, he definitely wouldn't have acted so impulsively. In the past, he only had evil thoughts, but he didn't have the courage to turn them into reality. Walking out from the warehouse, Hanshaw walked towards the dormitory where the female students lived. In the dead of night, Hanshaw sneakily came to the dormitory. Brian often came here to clean and was very familiar with the place. He was very clear where Lisa lived. There were far fewer male and female students in the necromancy major than in the other majors. Therefore, every female student had their own individual room. It was spacious inside and had all the amenities one could wish for. Compared to the garbage warehouse that Brian lived in, this was heaven. Lisa lived on the second floor and Hanshaw couldn't enter at night. But it was a good thing that there was a large tree behind Lisa's room. Hanshaw shrunk his body and climbed up the tree like a skinny monkey. He was just able to tiptoe and approach Lisa's window. The window wasn't closed. Hanshaw was secretly delighted. He stood on his tiptoes and moved his skinny body next to Lisa's window. Peering inside, he saw that the little witch Lisa's room was decorated in pink and looked very cute. There were some cute furry toys hanging on the table and walls inside. A faint fragrance flowed into Hanshaw's nose and mouth. Hanshaw wrinkled his nose. He hadn't thought that the ruthless and vicious Lisa would actually make her room so cute. Hanshaw knew that he couldn't beat her. He moved closer to the window and took another look. He discovered that there was a hazy pink curtain in the corner. Lisa's bed was there. He took out a small bottle from his bag and smeared some of the blood used for the experiment on his eyes, nostrils, and the corners of his lips. He looked at a broken and abandoned mirror, which Brian had picked up, and messed up his brown hair a little. When he looked at the mirror again, he saw a horrifying and gloomy face with bloodstains all over it. "Heh, even if I can't beat you, I'll scare you to death." Hanshaw was very satisfied with his current appearance. He nodded and laughed darkly in a low voice. After everything was in place, he stepped on the tree trunk and moved closer to Lisa's window. His body swayed along with the tree trunk as he extended his skinny right hand and knocked on Lisa's window. Knock knock, knock knock. Lisa seemed to be still dreaming. She was woken up by the knock knock on the window. She sleepily opened the pink curtain and walked out barefoot from inside. The carpet was also pink. Her jade-white feet landed on the carpet. Under the quiet moonlight, her 5 toes were pink and tender, appearing somewhat cute and moving. Lisa was a little younger than Brian and was a young lady of a noble family. Disregarding the way she treated Brian, Lisa was still an out-and-out little beauty. She had a head of soft golden hair, a height of 1.62 meters, and looked a little taller than Brian. She had slender eyebrows, a straight nose, and lovely red lips. Lisa, who was wearing pink pajamas, didn't seem to be completely awake. After walking out of the pink bed, she instinctively looked towards the source of the sound. A familiar face covered in blood. There were bloodstains on his eyes, nostrils, and the corners of his mouth. The long face looked sinister and terrifying. His thin and small body swayed left and right at the window as if he was weightless. His eyes were empty and lifeless as he stared at her. Wah! A startled cry rang through the entire female students' residential area. Han Shoror laughed darkly in his heart. He thought to himself, "I'll scare you to death this time, or at least make you faint." As he thought this, Han Shoror's expression became more and more terrifying. His empty eyes rolled back and his eyeballs rolled back and forth. His body swayed even more violently on the tree branches. Because his eyes were rolling back, Han Shoror couldn't see Lisa anymore. After the frightened cry and Han Shoror's expression became more and more terrifying, he suddenly didn't hear Lisa's voice anymore. She must have fainted from fright, Han Shoror thought. Hearing the curses of the necromancy major female students coming from all around, Han Shoror thought it was about time to retreat. Otherwise, he would be in deep trouble if he was caught. Just as he was about to restore his eyes to normal and flee, he suddenly felt a tremendous pain on the bridge of his nose, followed by another wave of pain on his head. His body involuntarily fell from the tree, his entire body aching and his head spinning. Attacks like raindrops then landed on Han Shoror's body with pitter-patter sounds. A voice scolded as it hit, "Brian, I didn't think you'd have a future. You didn't die last time, but is there something wrong with your brain? I cultivate necromancy magic and spend every day with skeletons and zombies. You idiot actually pretended to be a corpse to scare me. I really admire your idiotic behavior. Could it be that the future Grand Magus of the necromancy major, Lisa, can't even tell if a soul is in a body or not?" His body hurt greatly, but his heart hurt even more. This idiot Brian had stayed in the necromancy major as an errand boy for 6 years. How could he not know this bit of common sense? He had caused him to have the courage to do something bad for the first time, but he hadn't thought he would end up like this. Necromancy magic. This miraculous necromancy magic was actually able to tell even this kind of thing apart. It did have some skill. It looked like there were many things that he needed to learn in this foreign world. Otherwise, today's tragedy would have played out again. As the pain in his body intensified, Han Shoror's thoughts ran wild as he cried out in pain. He inwardly thought that Chu Kangming's demonic magic had the word demonic in it, and necromancy magic didn't sound like a good path just from the name. If he cultivated the two together, would there be a conflict? Or would it be stronger? Chapter 3. As Han Shoror's thoughts ran wild, he felt pain all over his body. That little witch Lisa was still madly beating him up. Poor Han Shoror's body was so weak that tears had flowed uncontrollably from his eyes when he'd been hit on the bridge of his nose. After falling down from the tree, the pain had made him dizzy and disoriented. He could only roll into a ball on the ground and expose the most fleshy parts for Lisa to hit, such as his buttocks. After a while, Han Shoror suddenly discovered something miraculous. A trace of magical yuan in his body just happened to travel to his buttocks at this moment. When Lisa's foot landed on the area where the magical yuan had flowed through, his buttocks didn't feel as much pain anymore. After the magical yuan had passed through the originally burning area, the pain had greatly decreased, and there seemed to be a very comfortable feeling. Han Shoror was baffled and thought to himself that the solid realm of magical yuan was truly a form of self-torture. As his thoughts ran wild, the trace of magical yuan had traveled to his right buttocks. Lisa's kick just so happened to land on Han Shoror's right buttocks where the magical yuan was. "Ah! Wah!" 2 cries, one high and one low, suddenly sounded from Han Shoror and Lisa's mouths. Lisa suddenly felt that Han Shoror's right buttocks were harder than iron and stone. Her little foot couldn't bear the immense pain and she immediately shrank her foot back and cried out. Han Shoror, on the other hand, felt that the place where Lisa had kicked not only didn't hurt at all, but instead felt very comfortable. His entire body was hurting, and this sudden comfortable feeling from that place made Han Shaw involuntarily cry out softly. This soft was also indescribably obscene, as if, "Brian, you idiot, why do you have rocks in your pants?" Lisa rubbed her jade-like little feet as she yelled angrily. Several female necromancy students also appeared around Han Shaw and Lisa at this time. All of them had sleepy eyes as they looked coldly at Han Shaw. His nose was no longer hurting, and his tears were no longer flowing uncontrollably. Han Shaw moved his body and sat up on the grass. He looked around and saw that Amy, Athena, and Bella, who was also a novice magic caster, were all glaring at him angrily. Killing intent, compared to Lisa, Amy, Athena, and Bella were a lot less good-looking. They were all 16 or 17 years old and weren't very pretty to begin with. Having their sleep disturbed would affect their beauty, so it was only natural that the three girls were in a very bad mood. "Idiot, what are you looking at? Tell me, why do you have rocks in your pants? You've kicked this lady's beautiful feet until they're purple. Ooh, it hurts." The little witch Lisa looked coldly at Han Shaw and put her hands on her hips as she spoke arrogantly. Her left foot was tiptoeing and looked a bit odd. "What an idiot." Han Shaw laughed coldly in his heart and then crawled up with some difficulty with a face full of bewilderment. He laughed dumbly and said, "No, I don't have any rocks in my pant." Turning around, Han Shaw faced the four necromancy girls with his buttocks. He undid his pants as he spoke, but before he could pull them down, for screams pierced through the air, followed by the sound of panicked footsteps. "Brian, you idiot, put your pants back on right now or I'll kill you." Lisa hurriedly yelled loudly, but there was an obvious sense of panic in her voice. "Oh." Han Shaw responded dumbly, but he was laughing sinisterly in his heart. "Do you think I can't handle a few tender little daisies?" When the man and four girls stood face to face again, Lisa looked closely at Han Shaw a few times and said indignantly, "I'll let you off the hook for hiding rocks in your pants. What were you planning to do by climbing up the tree by my window in the middle of the night?" "Heh heh." Laughing dumbly, Han Shaw pointed at a tattered bag on the tree and said matter-of-factly, "Take that tattered bag down. What are you doing in the middle of the night, taking a trash bag?" Lisa felt like she was about to go mad with anger as she roared angrily. Beginner mage Bella sighed lightly at this moment and said to Lisa, Lisa, can't you see by now that this Brian has gone mad? It looks like your wraith didn't kill him, but made him mad. Why should we bicker with a madman?" She covered her mouth and yawned, saying, "Oh, I still have class tomorrow, so I'm going back to sleep. Senior Lisa, do as you see fit." Amy seemed to sympathize with Han Shaw a bit and looked silently at Han Shaw. She shook her head lightly and sighed. She didn't say much and also turned to leave with Bella. If Han Shaw hadn't acted so crazily, apart from Lisa, he would likely have to suffer the wrath of the three girls. However, since he was a mentally unstable person, the three girls naturally wouldn't bicker with a madman. They let Han Shaw off just like that and went back to their sweet dreams. After the three girls left, only Lisa and Hu Shaw were left. Lisa glared fiercely at Han Shaw and said coldly, "Go do what you need to do, I'll deal with you in a couple of days. I'm tired today, if you dare disturb my sleep again, I won't just punch and kick you, I'll use magic to make you go crazy again." Lisa glared at Han Shaw again after she'd finished speaking and left with a bit of an unnatural gait. She even cried out softly as she walked through the door, "That hurts, that idiot had rocks in his pants. My wraith has indeed driven him mad." The place resumed its silence after Lisa had gone in. Han Shaw also felt a bit of lingering fear when he saw her go in. It was a good thing that Lisa hadn't used necromancy magic. Otherwise, with her magical powers as a beginner mage, Han Shaw would have really gone mad if she'd shot another wraith at him. When the song had ended and everyone had dispersed, Han Shaw didn't continue to stay here. He cursed lowly as he dragged his weak and frail body back to his warehouse in a sorry state. When he returned to the warehouse, he carelessly pulled out the mess of trash on his little bed and lay down to sleep. The next day, Han Shaw was sleeping soundly when the door to the warehouse was suddenly pushed open, followed by a loud wah cry. Opening his drowsy eyes, Han Shaw turned around and saw a little fatty with short golden hair and a dark green left eye, wearing the same rough clothes as Han Shoror. He pointed at Han Shoror with a face full of panic. You. He couldn't form a complete sentence. Oh, it's Jack. What are you doing in my room? Little fatty Jack was the same age as Brian. Perhaps it was because they were in the same boat, but Jack was one of the few in the necromancy major who treated Brian rather well. Little fatty Jack came from a poor family. 2 years ago, his father, old Jack, had sent him to the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force to work as an errand boy, earning a few silver coins every month. Although Jack and Brian were both errand boys, he wasn't sold to the Babylon Academy. Therefore, he had his own freedom, unlike Brian who had been sold to the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force as a slave. This was because Jack wasn't a slave. Although he was also an errand boy and would be bullied by the necromancy major students, the necromancy major students wouldn't treat him like Brian. They would beat and scold him, and occasionally use him for small experiments. However, they wouldn't treat him like a slave without regard for his life or death. Brian had always been quite envious of little fatty Jack, because little fatty Jack could eat his fill with every meal and didn't have to endure those inhuman tortures. As for little fatty Jack, he could only find a bit of confidence in Brian. Hence, the two of them were very close. Huff, that scared me to death. Brian, you didn't die, that's great. What's great about that? I'm starving to death. Jack, do you have anything to eat? If you do, give it to me and I'll return it to you later. Han Shoror discovered that little fatty Jack wasn't saying anything after he'd finished speaking, and was looking at him foolishly. His 2 small eyes, the size of soybeans, were quite odd on his chubby face. Han Shoror creased his brow and asked impatiently, "What is it? Do I look good?" Jack stared blankly, then looked at Han Shoror even more strangely. "You've never asked me for food all these years. You only eat when I give it to you. You also don't talk to me like you did just now. Brian, I've discovered that you're a bit different." Startled, Han Shoror thought to himself that Lisa and the others hadn't noticed anything different about him. He hadn't thought that the dumb fatty Jack would be able to sense it from the first sentence he'd spoken. Thinking about it later and recalling Brian's memories, Han Shoror discovered that Brian didn't talk to the necromancy major students at all. He did whatever they told him to do and didn't interact with them at all. However, Brian and Jack would talk from time to time. Although it was Jack talking and Brian listening most of the time, the two had spent a lot of time together. It was no wonder that Jack could so quickly sense that he was different. Laughing out loud, Han Shoror smiled faintly. "I was hit by Lisa's wraith and almost died. After this incident, I feel that I've been living the wrong way and want to change myself." Jack breathed a sigh of relief when he heard this and nodded. "So that's how it is. I thought you'd become stupid after being hit by the wraith." Han Shoror didn't know what to say. "Here, this is the black bread I've hidden. Take it and eat it. It's great that you didn't die. Everyone thought you were dead and couldn't find a new errand boy, so they gave your job to me. I had to wake up early in the morning and run over to you. I was in a hurry and accidentally bumped into Bark and got beaten up by him. Even my left eye is black now." Little fatty Jack spoke happily as he handed a piece of black bread to Han Shoror. It looked like Jack was quite happy that he didn't have to do Brian's job anymore. Han Shoror fiercely bit into the black bread when he saw the black eye around Jack's left eye. He said furiously, "Bark hit you again. He's too arrogant. Come, let's go get revenge." Jack jumped up in fright and grabbed onto Han Shoror, using his body weight to hold onto Han Shoror. He said hastily with surprise, "Brian, are you crazy? Aren't we used to this a long time ago? Bark is a magic apprentice in the necromancy major, and it's not the first time we've been beaten up. We should be happy that he's not looking for trouble with us. What revenge do we need from him?" Snorting coldly, Han Shoror said, "Don't worry, I naturally have a way. I'm crazy, and all the students in the necromancy major should know that I'm crazy by now. I'm King crazy, who am I afraid of?" Yelling, Han Shoror dragged Brian and walked out of the warehouse with his head held high. The magical yuan within Han Shoror's body seemed to be circulating even faster. Chapter 4. Early in the morning, the necromancy students all hastily got up and made their way to the Dark Mage's school building. Jack was panic-stricken and had an unwilling expression on his face. But when he heard Hansharaw's plan and thought of how Hansharaw was taking revenge for him, how could he be less than Brian if he wasn't afraid of someone as weak and cowardly as him? Jack finally agreed. There were many stone statues of the past top students of the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force on a bluestone path. These stone statues were incomparably tall and lifelike. These stone figures were the pride of the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. One of Brian's jobs was to clean the dust off these enormous stone statues. Brian had been doing this since he was 10 years old. Brian was even shorter at that time and had to carry a small ladder in order to complete his tasks with great difficulty. Otherwise, he wouldn't have any food to eat every day. Standing next to a stone statue of a bearded Grand Magus, Hanshaw wiped the dust off the chest of this Grand Magus named Claire. He said to Jack, "I say, Jack, when can our stone statues be placed here as well? Brian, don't let your imagination run wild. We're just errand slaves. As long as we can eat our fill and not be beaten up every day, how can we become mags?" "Oh, Brian, you're really a bit different now. You'd never let your imagination run wild before, and you definitely wouldn't come up with such a bad idea. Why not? If you want to become a magician, not only do you need to have great talent, you also need to enter a magic academy. You need to pay a lot of gold coins to the academy and go through layers of training. Even the children of nobles need to have great talent to become a magician. Commoners like us shouldn't even think about it. Oh, I forgot, you're still an errand slave without freedom. You're even worse off, there's no hope at all. We're in a magic academy right now, and we don't even need to pay any tuition fees. Heh, we're truly blessed by the heavens. If we don't learn some magic, how will we have the face to say that we're from the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force? Brian, you don't have to act so confident. We're not magic students, we're just servants. I can still leave the Academy of Magic in the future, but I'm afraid you won't be able to. Little fatty Jack saw that Hanshaw was absent-mindedly wiping Grand Magus Claire's statue. Jack didn't have his usual focus on work and only had a face full of ambition. He felt that Hanshaw was a bit strange and honestly spoke his mind. Let's not talk about this. Look at that little witch Lisa, she's finally here. Let's get down to business. Hanshaw saw the little witch Lisa from afar and stumbled over a bit. He thought to himself that Brian's 6 years as an errand boy at the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force had some use to him. At least he knew the routine of some people's lives. Lisa always woke up later than usual. Most of the time, she would walk slowly to the Magic Academy by herself. Today was no exception. The little witch Lisa was wearing a black mage robe this time. Her soft golden hair draped lazily over her shoulders. She didn't seem to have slept well last night and kept yawning as she walked. Lisa was very beautiful, but because she was only 16, her breasts didn't seem full enough, perhaps because she hadn't fully developed yet. It was said that Lisa was very dissatisfied with her flat breasts and had been thinking of ways to solve this problem recently. Hanshaw and Jack watched as Lisa walked over and continued wiping the dust off Grand Magus Claire's statue with a straight face. They seemed to be completely unaware that Lisa was walking in their direction as they murmured softly, "How is this possible? Did you hear wrong, Brian? Why would Bark say that about Lisa?" Suddenly, Jack, who had been mumbling in a low voice, suddenly raised his voice and shouted out in surprise. Lisa, who had been walking absent-mindedly, immediately focused all her attention when she heard someone mention her. She looked ahead vigilantly. Every girl wanted to know what others said about them behind their backs, and the little witch Lisa was naturally no exception. In addition, in order to prevent the two in front of her from seeing her and not daring to continue speaking, Lisa cleverly hid behind another statue and pricked up her ears with a face full of gossip, her eyes sneakily looking in that direction. So it was this half-crazy, half-stupid Brian. Lisa was infuriated and prepared to settle the score with him later. But before that, she wanted to hear what Bark had to say about her. Hanshaw had a silly smile on his face as he said dumbly, "I didn't hear wrong." Bark said to the other students on the way here that Lisa's breasts were as flat as a piece of bread that had been stepped on. Jack fiercely stifled his laughter as soon as these words left his mouth. His chubby face flushed red and his body trembled. On the other side, Lisa's ruddy face suddenly turned green as a fierce light flashed through her beautiful eyes. Her adorable lips slowly twitched as she ground her teeth so hard that they made crunching noises. She trembled behind the statue for a few seconds, and then walked quickly towards the school building with a murderous aura. She'd even forgotten that she'd originally planned to settle the score with Brian. Jack finally couldn't hold it in any longer as he watched the little witch Lisa leave the other way with a green face and a murderous aura. Waha! He exploded with laughter, feeling indescribably carefree in his heart. He said as he laughed, "Brian, you're just too evil. Even an errand boy like me knows that Bark likes Lisa. Lisa also hates it when people say that her breasts are small. Judging from her current appearance, Bark is sure to be in big trouble." Han Shaw chuckled sinisterly and immediately put away the brush in his hand. He urged Jack, "Let's not brush this Claire anymore, let's go take a look first." Little fatty Jack was egged on by Han Shaw and also heroically put the brush into the cloth bag at his waist. He laughed heartily and said, "Let's go, I want to see how Bark gets beaten up by Lisa. Damn it, I want him to beat me up this morning." The two little necromancy errand boys followed behind Lisa in high spirits as they quickly ran towards the necromancy major's school building. Some of the necromancy students were baffled along the way, wondering why the two most timid errand boys had taken the wrong medicine today. The necromancy major belonged to the Babylon Magic Academy and was a branch of the Dark Major. They shared the same school building with the Dark Major students, and there were teachers guiding the students in their magic studies every day. One had to admire the little she-devil Lisa's speed of action. When Han Shaw and Jack arrived, they discovered that Lisa had already flipped out and started fighting with Bark. "Lisa, even the errand boys of the necromancy major know my feelings for you. How could I speak ill of you? Who did you hear this from?" Bark's left eye was already swollen and bruised as he dodged a bow and arrow shot. He hurriedly took the time to yell loudly and looked extremely aggrieved. Bark had been knocked into by Jack on the way and had given Jack a good beating. Brian naturally suffered even more at his hands. Bark was the son of a minor noble and was 17 years old this year. He was only a mage apprentice of the lowest rank and naturally had no advantage over Lisa, who was already a novice necromancer. In addition, Bark liked Lisa and was even more cautious when he attacked. It was no wonder that he'd fallen for Lisa's trick in a short while when faced with the furious Lisa. "Humph, don't worry about that. He said it unintentionally, so there's no way he's wrong. Since you're so vicious, then take this." Han Shaw and Jack had indeed said it unintentionally, and Han Shaw was a half-crazy, half-stupid person. Logically speaking, this kind of person would never fabricate a lie, much less an errand boy. He wouldn't dare to make something up. Because it involved Lisa's taboo and there were many people watching, Lisa naturally wouldn't say it out loud in case others made fun of her. She was going all out this time to teach Bark a lesson. "Fallen warriors of the dead, answer the Dark Herald's call and reveal your existence." Lisa raised her slender arms high into the air as she chanted an incantation. As soon as her voice faded, two ghastly white skeletal warriors appeared in front of her, wielding similarly snow-white bone blades. She pointed her finger at them, and they raised their blades and charged at Bark with a crunching sound. Off to the side, Han Shaw was flabbergasted. This was the first time he'd seen this mysterious necromancy magic with his own eyes. The curiosity and excitement in his heart had been raised to the peak as he watched with rapt attention. Lisa's mental strength isn't weak, to actually be able to summon two skeletal warriors. Humph, the necromancy major is weak as hell to begin with, and they're not united. No wonder the necromancy major is the weakest major in the Academy of Magic. What a disgrace to the Dark Major. After Lisa summoned the two skeletal warriors, some of the Dark Major students who were watching from the sidelines began to discuss it one by one. From their conversation, Han Shaw knew that the same spell could be divided into 5 levels due to the difference in mental strength. If this necromancy magic that summoned skeletons was summoned by an archmage necromancer with a strong mental strength, they would be able to summon even more skeletal warriors. Bark had a dejected look on his face as he cursed the rumormonger a few hundred times in his heart. If Bark had practiced the Dark Major's curses and his mental strength was strong enough, then Han Shaw and Jack would likely be watching a joke right now. Frantically being chased around by the two skeletal warriors, Bark had no choice but to use the same spell and summon a little skull. One man and one skeleton fought against Lisa's two little skulls. When some of the Dark Major students saw Barker in such a sorry state, they all loudly mocked him. Barker was affected by the mockery and became even more flustered in his distraught state. He was kicked in the stomach by one of Lisa's skeletal warriors, and his face immediately turned purple from the pain. He slowly crouched down. Lisa saw that Bark had been hit by the little skull and saw that the little skull had raised its ghastly white bone dagger. She hurriedly stopped it and sent the two summoned little skulls to another dimension. After all, this wasn't a battle of life and death, and the School of Magic strictly forbade students from fighting to the death. Lisa naturally didn't dare make a move. Her anger had mostly dissipated when she saw that Bark was injured. After Bark stood up, he also sent the little skull that he had summoned back to another dimension. He swept his eyes around and saw that Hanshoro and Jack were laughing heartily at him in front of him. Bark was in a bad mood and immediately ran over in a rage, cursing as he ran, "You two lowly servants, you dare make fun of me." Bark didn't dare vent his anger on Lisa, and even less on the Dark Major seniors nearby. There were only two errand boys, Hanshoro and Jack, that he could vent his anger on. Not to mention that the two were laughing heartily, which naturally provoked Bark. Lisa's anger had been about to subside when she saw Bark arrogantly run off in front of her, but when she saw that Bark was ignoring her like this, her temper flared up again. She chanted with a cold face, "Endless darkness, grant me the power of death. Inflict the agony of the soul upon him, the agony of the soul." As soon as Lisa finished her incantation, a dark mass of air flew towards Bark. That dark mass of air floated in the air, constantly twisting and changing until it finally became a pulsating dark flame. Bark's expression changed again when he heard Lisa chant the incantation and turned to see the magical flames of the agony of the soul shooting towards him. Then, he suddenly thought of something and charged fiercely towards Hanshoro and Jack. He suddenly rolled on the ground just as the agony of the soul was about to hit him. Hanshoro, who'd been laughing heartily after his scheme had succeeded, wasn't the slightest bit on guard. He could only watch as Bark suddenly rolled away and the agony of the soul smashed into his body. Hanshoro's eyes rolled back as he felt a sharp pain in his head. He fell backwards stiffly, still laughing heartily. Chapter 5. When Hanshoro woke up, he discovered that he was lying on a small wooden bed in the warehouse. His body was drenched in cold water. Across from him, little fatty Jack was holding a small wooden bucket in his hand. He was laboriously stepping on a stool, intending to pour the cold water out of the bucket. The weather was a bit cold to begin with, and Hanshoro was completely drenched from the cold. When he saw that little fatty Jack was about to pour the bucket of water on him, he suddenly yelled, "Jack, what are you doing?" The stool that little fatty Jack was stepping on was also a discarded product, and it was already wobbly to begin with. When he was startled by Hanshoro's yell, his heart skipped a beat, and his hand shook. The cold water in the small wooden bucket was once again poured onto Hanshoro's head. Even the small wooden bucket flew out of his hand and smashed onto Hanshoro's chest. "Ooh! I say, Jack, are you trying to play me to death?" Hanshoro's entire body was shivering from the cold when he was splashed with the second bucket of cold water. His chest was smashed by the small wooden bucket again, and the pain was unbearable. He immediately grimaced in pain and screamed, "I'm sorry, Brian, I thought I didn't wake you up with the first bucket. Your stool was already wobbling, and you screamed. I was so frightened by you that my hand shook, and I poured the water in the wooden bucket on you." Little fatty Jack's face was full of embarrassment as he picked up a piece of ragged cloth from the side and wiped it on Hanshoro's body. He wanted to clean up the water on Hanshoro's neck first. Who knew that Hanshoro would squeal like a pig being slaughtered again, and stumbled away in a panic. He hurriedly said, "Jack, there's bone powder on the ragged cloth in your hand that's gone bad from necromancy magic experiments. This stuff pricks people like little needles. You're not trying to stab me to death, are you?" "Ah. I'm sorry, Brian, I didn't do it on purpose, I really didn't do it on purpose." Jack was also a little panicked. He hurriedly threw the rag in his hand far away. He was glad that there was no bone powder on the side he was holding. Achoo, achoo, forget it, forget it. Jack, why am I here? I remember that I was used as a shield by that bastard Barker and was struck by that little witch Lisa's agony of the soul. Hanshoro sneezed and his neck turned red. He hurriedly took off his wet clothes and found the black towel that Brian used to wipe off the cold water droplets on his body. Brian, you have so many scars on your body. When he heard Jack's words, Hanshoro couldn't help but take a serious look at his own body for the first time. There wasn't a single part of his body that didn't have scars. Hanshoro sighed inwardly and once again felt sad for Brian's misfortune. Scars are a man's memories and medals. What do you know? Hurry up and tell me what happened after I fainted. Class just happened to start at the Dark Academy after you fainted from the agony of the soul. Lisa said a few words and hurried off to class. I called Uncle Sel and the two of us carried you back. So it was Uncle Sel who came. Oh right, what did Lisa say before she left? Hanshoro nodded as he wiped his body. Uncle Sel was the oldest errand boy in the necromancy major. He was over 50 years old and was usually quite nice to Brian and Jack. Ever since Brian came to the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force as an errand boy, Sel had been an errand boy for more than 10 years. Lisa said that you were unlucky. If the agony of the soul had been inflicted on Barker, he would have only needed 3 days of pain with his mental strength as a magic apprentice. But you're not a student of the necromancy major and don't have any mental strength. You'll probably be in pain for a month. She said that you disturbed her sleep last night and even put rocks in your pants, hurting her feet when you kicked her. She won't help you relieve the agony of the soul. Damn it, this Lisa dares to treat me like this. I'll deal with her sooner or later. Hanshoro's face immediately grew cold when he heard Jack's words and he cursed aloud, giving Jack quite a fright. It wasn't the first time that Lisa had treated him like this, but he hadn't seen him do anything to her. When Hanshoro had finished cursing, he thought for a moment and said, Barker is a magic apprentice and can feel the pain for 3 days with mental strength, but I'll be in pain for a month. Heh. My potential is extraordinary. If I learn necromancy magic, maybe I'll be fine in 3 days. Brian, you're an errand boy, how can you learn magic? Then how do magic students learn magic? First meditate and sense the magical elements. When I have mental strength, then study the knowledge in the books and practice magic according to the incantations. If there's anything I don't understand, ask the magic teacher. Jack thought for a moment and said matter-of-factly, then isn't that fine? I can meditate too. When I have mental strength, can't I learn the incantations from the books and practice magic? But you don't have any books. At this point in the conversation, Hanshoro walked up to little fatty Jack in a very friendly manner and suddenly put his arm around Jack. He smiled merrily at Jack. Don't I still have you? Aren't you cleaning the library? Jack jumped in fright and hurriedly moved away from Hanshoro. He said with a face full of panic, Brian, you want me to steal books for you? Vulgar. How can this be called stealing? I'm only asking you to borrow books. You can just put them back when I'm done. Not many people read those books on the foundations of magic anyways. No one will know about this. Jack, I'm so unlucky today because I helped you. Shouldn't you help me too? Hanshoro stared at little fatty Jack and said righteously. Jack's face was full of hesitation when he heard Hanshoro's words, but under Hanshoro's emotional assault, he finally reluctantly agreed to borrow the books for Hanshoro. Jack stealthily found Hanshoro at night and pulled out the foundations of necromancy and a magical dictionary from his fat belly. He handed them to Hanshoro and exhorted him for a long time before sneaking away. With Brian's status as an errand slave, he didn't have the right to learn how to read. However, because he had to do everything, he did learn quite a bit over the past 6 years due to the demands of his work. He passed all of this knowledge to Hanshoro, so Hanshoro was able to understand the words on these 2 books. Hanshoro closed the little wooden door to the warehouse after Jack left and flipped open the first light yellow page of the Foundations of Necromancy, reading with great interest. Magic was a method of using the mental strength to communicate with the magical elements in this world. There were 4 ways to use magic: incantations, magic scrolls, primers, hand gestures, and magic matrices. Necromancy magic had once been extremely prosperous. When necromancy magic was at its peak, all dark magic was classified as necromancy magic. It was a pity that necromancy magic had declined, and necromancy magic had become a branch of dark magic. In the beginning, necromancy magic was only used to control souls and bones. In the process of development, predecessors continuously experimented and improved, causing the number of spells in necromancy magic to increase. It slowly formed a system and finally became the representative of dark magic. The basis of any magic was mental strength, and the way to obtain mental strength was to meditate and feel the magical elements that ordinary people couldn't. Only when one had developed mental strength through meditation could one be considered a magic apprentice. Therefore, when Han Shoror was studying the foundations of necromancy, the first thing he did was to meditate to feel his mental strength. However, Han Shoror meditated for 7 days straight and gained nothing. He couldn't form a trace of mental strength at all. Therefore, during these 7 days, Han Shoror only meditated and trained at night. During the day, he still diligently played the role of Brian, cleaning, removing bugs, and taking out the trash. Because if he didn't do this, Han Shoror, as an errand slave, wouldn't be able to eat anything in the academy, and wouldn't be able to continue staying in the academy. Because of the agony of the soul, Han Shoror's brain would suddenly hurt a few times every day. The first 2 times, Han Shoror immediately fainted again, but later on, although it would still hurt from time to time, Han Shoror didn't faint again, perhaps due to his adaptability. During this period of time, Han Shoror's reputation of being half crazy and half foolish had also spread. However, although Han Shoror looked crazy and foolish, he still did what he was supposed to do every day. The Babylon Academy of Magic and Force didn't chase him out of the academy when they saw that Han Shoror still did what he was supposed to do despite looking crazy and foolish. The necromancy students all agreed that Han Shoror's strange behavior was that Han Shoror had been doing this for 6 years and had formed a habit. Therefore, although he was a bit crazy, this habit couldn't be changed, and he still did what he was supposed to do every day. However, during these days, whenever the students who wanted to find Han Shoror to experiment with magic found him, Han Shoror would suddenly have a headache at the right time. When he had a headache, he would go even crazier. Sometimes, Han Shoror would mess up the experiment. The students all knew that Han Shoror had been hit by Lisa's agony of the soul, and that he was a bit crazy and foolish, so they couldn't do much to him. No one knew why Lisa had beaten Bark up, but Bark had been quite depressed during this time and would find excuses to beat Han Shoror up. Bark was a magic apprentice, and his body was stronger than Han Shoror's. Even when Han Shoror pretended to be crazy and fought with him, he was still beaten up quite a bit. When he returned to the warehouse at night, Han Shoror immediately cursed as soon as he walked in, "Bark, you scum, just you wait, I'll beat you up so badly that even your parents won't recognize you." Today, Han Shoror had been beaten up by Bark again. Bark and a little skull were fighting Han Shoror alone, so Han Shoror naturally couldn't beat them. He was covered in bruises all over his body. But these days, Han Shoror felt that his strength was increasing, and his appetite had also increased greatly. Every time he didn't have enough food to eat, he would have to ask Jack for more. And every time he was beaten up by Bark, although it was painful, Han Shoror only needed to practice the solid method of magical yuan after returning to the warehouse. Not only would his body not hurt at all when he woke up the next day, he would even be in very good spirits. When he fought Bark again, he discovered that the pain on his body was getting lighter and lighter. Therefore, every time Han Shoror was beaten up, he would immediately return to the warehouse and start practicing magical yuan. That bit of magical yuan in his body had also unknowingly grown a little during this period of time. It seemed that every time Han Shoror was beaten up and returned to practice magical yuan, his body was slowly being forged, and his magical yuan had gradually grown from the size of a fingernail to the size of a thumb. This made Han Shoror both excited and afraid. He was excited that the magical yuan was growing stronger, and that his body and spirit were getting better and better. He was afraid that because the magical yuan was slowly growing, Han Shoror would sometimes find it harder and harder to control his temper, and would easily do things that he was afraid of and would regret later on. Han Shoror pulled out the foundations of necromancy from under the little wooden bed. After reading it for a while, Han Shuo once again started meditating out of habit. The magical yuan in his body also continued to roam around every part of his body irregularly. Han Shuo felt very comfortable after the magical yuan flowed past the areas that hurt. As Han Shuo meditated, that strand of magical yuan slowly flowed from his neck to Han Shuo's brain. It was at this moment that a familiar pain suddenly radiated from Han Shuo's brain. At this moment, Han Shuo knew that the agony of the soul that Lisa had released was acting up again. Suddenly, that strand of magical yuan seemed to have entered the center of Han Shuo's pain just as his brain was in pain. This was the first time that the agony of the soul had acted up, and the magical yuan had just so happened to enter his brain. Han Shuo felt as if a cannon had been set off in his brain, and then his head ached again as he fainted. Chapter 6. When Han Shuo woke up, he discovered that it was already late at night. The magical yuan in his body was still flowing irregularly, but there seemed to be something more in his mind. Everything around him seemed to be much clearer. A thought struck him as Han Shuo once again held his breath and focused his mind into meditation. Han Shuo carefully sensed his body according to the basics of necromancy, and finally confirmed that the magical yuan had flowed into his brain when the agony of the soul had flared up, and that he'd inexplicably cultivated mental strength. Waha, looks like I'm a genius, to be able to cultivate mental strength so quickly. Heh. Maybe I should try out the lowest level of necromancy magic and see if I can summon a skeletal warrior. He hurriedly took out the basics of necromancy from his bed and flipped through it for a long time, but he couldn't find the incantation to summon a skeletal warrior. It was then that Han Shuo discovered that this book only recorded the basics of necromancy magic, and didn't contain any incantations or magic spells. Han Shuo frowned as he thought for a while, and remembered Lisa's summoning incantation from back then. He immediately raised his hands high and focused all of his mental strength, chanting the summoning incantation for necromancy magic. Fallen warrior of the dead, heed the dark emissary's call and reveal your existence. When Han Shuo finished reciting the incantation, he suddenly felt the weak mental strength in his brain rapidly drain away. It was all sucked away in an instant. He vaguely felt something, and then his head hurt. His body collapsed onto the bed, panting heavily. As Han Shuo sat down weakly, a black light flashed in his small warehouse, and a ghastly white little skull that was half the size of the one Lisa had summoned last time appeared. Han Shuo was wild with joy as he looked at this snow-white little skull that held a dagger-like bone knife in its hand, and its two empty eyes facing him. Although this little skull was a size smaller than the one Lisa had summoned, it was still a little skull. This also meant that his necromancy magic had succeeded. His body collapsed and his mind felt groggy. Han Shuo knew through the basics of necromancy that his mental strength was too weak. Even summoning this little skull had exhausted all of his mental strength. Looking at the little skull in front of him, Han Shuo felt that he had an inexplicable connection with it. However, Han Shuo's mental strength was pitifully weak, and he couldn't even send a command with his mental strength, let alone send the little skull back to the other dimension. The man and skeleton looked at each other for a while. Han Shuo thought to himself that no one would come to this warehouse anyway. This little skull wouldn't run around without Han Shuo's orders, so it didn't matter. It was already the middle of the night. Han Shuo had been tossing and turning for so long and was exhausted. After the surprise just now, Han Shuo felt a little tired and fell asleep in a daze. The next day, before the sky was completely bright, Han Shuo had already woken up. During this period of time, Han Shuo had gotten used to disposing of the garbage piled up in the warehouse before anyone else woke up. After waking up today, he was about to do the same thing when he suddenly saw the little skull next to the pile of garbage. After a nap, Han Shuo's mental strength had recovered a little. He definitely didn't have enough mental strength to send the little skull back to the other dimension, but if he gave it a command, it would be enough. Thinking of this, Han Shuo gathered his mental strength and sent the first command to the little skull, help him dispose of the garbage. After the command, the little skull's leg bone straightened, slowly stretched out 5 white bone fingers, grabbed a pile of garbage next to it, opened the door and walked out. No wonder everyone wants to learn magic. Magic really saves a lot of trouble. In the future, this little skull will help me dispose of the garbage early in the morning. Han Shoror looked at the sky and saw that it was still early. He suddenly fell back to the small bed and continued to sleep. This was the first time in days that Han Shoror slept in the morning. After taking a nap, when Han Shoror opened his eyes, he found that the little skull had returned. It seemed that the garbage had been disposed of according to his order. Climbing down from the small bed, when Han Shoror washed his face, he noticed that the purplish color on his face yesterday had magically disappeared today. Even some of the scars on his left and right hands seemed to be molting and fading. Apart from feeling a bit dizzy because he'd used up all of his mental strength yesterday, Han Shoror's physical condition was quite good. The solid stage of magical yuan would transform the entire body. When he passed the solid stage, all of the scars on his body would definitely disappear, and the strength and flexibility of his body would greatly increase. At that time, whether it was Bark or Lisa, they'd likely lose for sure if they used skeletons to fight him one-on-one. Han Shoror thought as he washed his face. He looked at the necromancy students on the road and saw that they were all heading to the Dark Academy to attend classes. He also hurriedly picked up his tools and ran to the road to clean the statues of the top students from the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. Athena, I went to the toilet before the sun rose this morning and saw a very small skeleton outside the window. It was clutching 2 garbage bags in its hands and slowly walking in the direction of the garbage dump. How strange. Magic apprentice Amy said to Athena beside her as they walked towards the Dark Mage's teaching block. Crazy, what student would be so bored as to summon a little skull to take out the garbage? Isn't this all done by that half-crazy, half-idiot Brian? It's true, I really did see a very small skeleton clutching 2 garbage bags. Also, I feel that Brian is so pitiful. He was already very miserable, and now he's been turned into this by Lisa. He's even been beaten up by Bark every day. You must be dreaming and seeing things. Brian is an errand slave, and he was sold to the academy. He's a slave, it's good enough that he's still alive. You're too kind, what are you worrying about him for? The 2 female students walked further and further away, and Brian couldn't hear what they were saying anymore. Jack came back after a while and wiped off the dust with Han Shoror. Jack wiped for a while and looked dazedly at Han Shoror. Brian, I've noticed that you seem to have put on a bit of flesh. Also, weren't you beaten up by Bark yesterday? I saw that your face was green and purple last night. Why can't I see any of that now? Bark must have done too much exercise recently. Look at his dull eyes and he looks very weak. Where would he have any strength left? If this goes on, he probably won't be able to beat me. At this point, Han Shoror felt that his stomach was empty and immediately said to Jack, My appetite has been a bit large recently, give me some of the things you're hiding on you. Hey, how did you know that I'm hiding bread on me? All the students and errand slaves of the Major know that you have the habit of hiding food on you, but you insist that it's a secret. Stop blabbering and give me the bread. I'll return it to you in the future. Jack took out a piece of bread unwillingly when he heard Han Shoror say this. He looked at the bread in his hand and broke off a piece before handing it to Han Shoror. Jack suddenly said when Han Shoror stopped what he was doing and was furiously devouring the bread, Hush. Bark's here. And Lisa. Bark held 2 exquisite white boxes in his hands and followed behind Lisa with a fawning smile on his face. He said fawningly, Lisa, these are snacks that my family specially sent over for me. They're very delicious. You definitely haven't had breakfast yet, have a taste. When Bark had beaten up Han Shoror yesterday, he'd accidentally received a punch on the right side of his face from Han Shoror. The right side of his face was still a bit bruised, and when he smiled and spoke, the right side of his face seemed to hurt a bit. He grimaced and twitched, making his smile appear a bit ugly. Humph, I'm not hungry. Don't give me that. I hate people like you the most, people who fawn on the surface and badmouth others behind their backs. Lisa didn't even look at Bark and only cared about walking forward. When she reached Brian and Jack's side, she looked coldly at Brian and said, Brian, when your agony of the soul ends in a month, I'll find you to properly practice with then. After hearing Lisa's words, Han Shoror finally remembered that the agony of the soul hadn't acted up since this morning. Han Shoror guessed that the agony of the soul magic must have dissipated after cultivating mental strength yesterday. Otherwise, it wouldn't have acted up until now. Lisa was about to leave after she finished speaking. However, after Buck glanced at Brian, he exclaimed in surprise, how is this possible? I clearly remember that I beat you until your face turned purple yesterday. Why is it all gone today? Damn it, you remember it so well. Han Shoror looked foolishly at Bark and laughed like a lunatic. Heh, I've taken good care of myself. Lisa was about to leave when she heard Han Shoror's words and couldn't help but laugh softly. Her beautiful eyes curved into crescent moons, making her look exceedingly adorable. This idiot Brian's speech was quite interesting after he'd gone mad. He wasn't as silent as before. Lisa thought to herself and wasn't in a hurry to leave. Jack knew that Han Shoror wasn't an idiot and knew that Han Shoror was purposefully making fun of Bark when he heard Han Shoror's words. He wanted to stifle his laughter but failed and laughed lightly. By the time Jack realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Bark was inwardly angry and thought that the right side of my face hadn't recovered yet, but this idiot had. Bark didn't dare say anything when Lisa laughed, but Jack's laughter immediately enraged Bark. Bark quickly stomped over to Jack and cursed angrily, "You lowly servant, how dare you make fun of me? I'll beat you to death." Jack knew that the situation wasn't looking good. He stood where he was but didn't dare run away as he watched Bark charge over. He could only wait pitifully to be beaten. It was at this moment that Han Shoror suddenly clutched his head and cried out, "Ouch!" He suddenly stood in front of Jack. Bark saw that it was Han Shoror and thought that he'd beat Han Shoror again. He raised his fist and threw a punch at Han Shoror's face. Bam! Han Shoror was hit, but he felt that Bark's punch was a bit lighter than yesterday. Han Shoror's thin body didn't even sway when the punch landed. However, Han Shoror still cried out, "Ouch!" He didn't even look as if he'd suddenly gone mad as his two hands wildly punched forward. Bark's left eye immediately turned black as he clutched his stomach and jumped up and down. "Lowly servant, how dare you hit me? I'm going to kill you with necromancy magic today." "Bark, you're bullying Brian again. Class has already started, go back to the classroom." A gentle and beautiful voice suddenly sounded from afar as a tall, slender, and beautiful girl with long, light purple hair slowly walked over from afar. She looked to be in her mid-20s with a straight nose, a goose-egg-shaped face, and rosy, sexy lips. Her wheat-colored skin looked quite healthy, and she wore a slightly tight mage robe with gold trimmings. The tight mage robe perfectly set off her full, towering breasts and long, slender legs. She held a few magic books in her left hand and an emerald-embedded magic staff in her right as she spoke to Brian. Master Fanny, you're not wearing your glasses today. You're talking about Brian." Lisa pouted and reminded her with a bit of exasperation. "Glasses are a fatal blow to a beauty's beauty. I don't want to wear that every day." Fanny smiled faintly and finally found Bark. She made a knocking motion with the magic staff in her right hand and said fiercely, "Go back to class immediately or you'll know the consequences." Fanny revealed a gentle smile again after speaking to Bark fiercely. She smiled at Lisa and said, "Lisa, you need to hurry to class as well. You're not a good student if you're always late. I still need to prepare for today's lesson, so I'll be leaving first." Fanny turned back to glare at Bark after she'd finished speaking. Her two long, slender, and beautiful legs lifted as she walked forward gracefully. Her two round, perky buttocks appeared indescribably captivating as she walked. Master Fanny, that's not the classroom building. You're going in the wrong direction. Oh my God, you'd better wear your glasses." Lisa exclaimed softly and was about to leave when she thought of something. She paused and swept a cold glance over Bark. She said disdainfully, "Useless fellow, you can't even beat an errand boy." Lisa then looked at Han Shoror and quickly chased after Fanny. Bark was seething with anger and pointed viciously at Han Shoror and Jack. "You two lowly servants, just you wait. I'll get even with you." He then hurried off to class as well. It looked like Fanny's threat was quite effective. Han Shoror looked in the direction that Fanny had disappeared with a dazed expression and watched Fanny leave. He didn't take Bark's threat to heart and murmured when Fanny had completely disappeared, "Master Fanny is quite interesting. No wonder that idiot Brian has a crush on her. To think that Brian's taste is about the same as mine. Brian, stop looking. I know that you've liked Master Fanny for a long time. Master Fanny has also told some students not to bully you. However, you're just an errand boy, and she's an adept mage of the academy. Do you know how strong adept mags are? Although Master Fanny is a bit short-sighted, there are too many people in the academy who have a crush on her. You should wake up soon. Jack's plump hands waved repeatedly in front of Han Shoror's face, reminding Han Shoror to face reality and wake up soon. I'm already drunk and can't wake up, Han Shoror said lecherously. He paused and added, I'll get her sooner or later. Chapter 7. Of course, these weren't things that Han Shoror could do at the moment. Han Shoror found the simplest way to refine it, and found 7 white bone spurs from an unknown magical beast in the warehouse. He then stuck them into the barrel according to the magical yin concentration matrix. Han Shoror's heart suddenly relaxed when he saw the 7 whirlpools appear. He knew that his messy messing around had actually succeeded. Although he didn't know what would become of the little skull in the end, Han Shoror was already at ease. He meditated for a while and slowly fell into a deep sleep. At this moment, Han Shoror suddenly stood up with a loud ooh, and Carey's right foot came flying over, kicking Han Shoror in the chest. Han Shoror cried out in pain and grabbed Carey's right leg with both hands, lifting it up. Carey cried out and fell to the side, his body crashing into another stone statue. He grimaced in pain. When Carey and Borge came over, Han Shoror cried out in pain and flailed his arms and legs wildly. Although his body had taken a few punches and kicks, Carey and Borge didn't have it easy either. They were also hit by Han Shoror's random attacks. Ah, my head hurts. Han Shoror hugged his head and squatted on the ground, his body shaking with a pained expression. Jack had originally wanted to go clean the lab, but when he saw Han Shoror doing this again, his heart skipped a beat. He stood there motionless, looking at Han Shoror expectantly. Han Shoror took advantage of the dead of night to sneakily return to the cabin. Carefully closing the door, Han Shoror put down the barrel and placed the little skull inside. He then tossed in some messy low-level magical beast blood, bone powder, lizard tail, and other materials. He then poured in a bucket of water. The contents of the wooden barrel were all mixed together and looked very ugly. Only the little skull's skull could be seen, and it was at a loss as to what was going on. After a long while, he suddenly remembered a method to refine demonic treasures. Han Shoror remembered that he had only been learning necromancy magic for a short time, and had only summoned a weak little skull. Since that was the case, he decided to test it out on the little skull first. Closing his eyes, Han Shoror thought for a while, slowly going through Chu Kanglan's knowledge on refining demonic treasures. Apart from various materials, special formations were needed to be set up in order to refine demonic treasures, as well as the most basic magical yuan of a demonic practitioner. It would take a few days or months to refine according to a special method. Some particularly powerful demonic treasures would even take years to refine. He stuck the 7 bone spurs into the barrel as a substitute for the yin demon, then squatted down in the barrel and tried to circulate the magical yuan to his right middle finger. He abruptly stabbed his finger into the center of the 7 bone spurs. Although the 7 bone spurs were substitutes, they could actually absorb a bit of magical yuan if they were arranged in the right way. Some special demonic treasures required very demanding and complex materials, and no one knew if they existed in this world. Han Shoror didn't care. He randomly assembled the materials needed to refine demonic treasures and did as he thought. He got up and returned to the laboratory, where he took out a small barrel that no one was using, and some necromancy materials that the students hadn't finished using. Han Shoror didn't know the names of those materials. That night, when he returned to the small wooden hut and was about to habitually meditate, he suddenly remembered the mysterious records on refining demonic treasures that old lunatic Chu Kanglan had left in his mind. He thought to himself that although the demonic arts he practiced and the necromancy magic he was learning now belonged to 2 different worlds, they both belonged to the path of evil, and there seemed to be some similarities. He wondered if he could combine them. When Han Shoror began to seriously recall his memories with a frown, he discovered that although Chu Kanglen had left behind many memories, most of them felt hazy and indistinct when he tried to recall them. It was as if he was looking at something through a thin, blurry piece of paper, and couldn't see everything clearly. Han Shuo was used to being beaten up. Add to that the fact that the magical yuan had transformed his body through the solid circulation method, he was able to completely withstand the punches of Carey and Borge. His physical strength had also improved, and Carey and Borge's faces were red and blue when their fists danced in the air. They looked much more wretched than Han Shuo. After studying the foundations of necromancy during this period of time, Han Shuo understood that his mental strength was very weak. He would focus on meditation every day when he returned to the small wooden hut. Little Skull was the weakest dark creature in the other dimension. Its intelligence was so low that it could only act according to the summoner's orders. Under Han Shuo's orders, Little Skull stayed in the small wooden hut during the day, and only went to dispose of the garbage bags late at night. Brian, I didn't believe them when they said you were crazy, but now even I believe them. You're really crazy. Jack twisted his chubby neck, shook his head, and sighed when he saw Han Shuo's face full of infatuation and his big talk about taking care of Fanny. In the next few days, Han Shuo's head didn't hurt anymore. For some reason, Bark didn't immediately seek revenge on Han Shuo. Han Shuo and Jack both gave up on Carey and Borge's missions. Last time, they couldn't beat Han Shuo alone, so they didn't have anything to say now. They obediently did what they were supposed to do in the first place. He praised repeatedly as he ate, "TSK TSK, it's delicious indeed. This fight wasn't for nothing. Here, I just borrowed half a loaf of bread from you, and now I'm returning you a box of exquisite pastries. You've earned big this time. I even dared to beat up Bark, not to mention you two idiots." Han Shuo still clutched his head in pain, but a hint of a grim smile appeared on his lips. After an indeterminate amount of time, 7 miniature whirlpools suddenly appeared in the water with the 7 bone spurs as the center. Hey, those are the pastries that Bark used to curry favor with Lisa. Haha, we're so lucky. I haven't tasted the delicacies of nobles yet. Han Shuo saw that Bark was in a hurry to leave and didn't take the pastries with him. He immediately sprinted over and picked up the 2 boxes of exquisite pastries without another word. He started munching on them without a second thought. This was a great fight. Jack, we don't have to do Carey and Borge's work anymore. If they dare bully you again, tell me, I'll beat them to death. Good, Brian, you actually dared to fight back. Borge, let's go together and teach this kid a good lesson today. Carey crawled up with a pained cry and charged at Han Shuo again, yelling at Borge to attack together. To refine a yin demon, one must first have a nether spirit. A person who died unjustly would be buried in a place of extreme yin after death. Only if the soul was unwilling to leave could it become a nether spirit. Refining a nether spirit into a yin demon required some special methods. Naturally, Han Shuo couldn't do it at the moment. Borge smiled when he saw Carey charge at Han Shuo. He thought that Han Shuo was courting death. Little did he know that Han Shuo had taken a kick, but it looked like Carey was in an even worse state. Just as Han Shuo and Jack finished eating the exquisite pastries and couldn't help but sigh at the deliciousness of the taste, 2 slightly older servants suddenly walked over from behind. They were holding brooms in their hands and were shouting at Han Shuo and Jack, urging Han Shuo and Jack to hurry up and clean up the laboratory. The Yin Demon Concentration Matrix was a kind of magical cultivation matrix in Chu Kanglen's memories. The correct method was to first refine 7 Yin demons and form a matrix with the 7 Yin demons. The magical essence of the refiner would be injected into the matrix, and the 7 Yin demons would firmly condense the magical essence of the refiner within the matrix according to the matrix. They would then slowly dissolve the materials used to refine the demonic treasure bit by bit and then infiltrate the main materials. The demonic treasure would be considered complete after 36 days of refining with the help of the magical yuan. I don't care if you're crazy or pretending to be crazy. If you dare disobey, I'll beat you until you do. Carey's temper was even worse. He took 3 large strides over and raised his right leg to kick at Han Shuo's crouching body. You're not going? Brian, have you really gone mad? You even dare disobey Master Borge's words. Do you want me to beat you awake? Borge clenched his right hand into a fist and sneered at Han Shor. I'm not going. Han Shor ignored him. He'd long since wanted to give up. Now that his body felt sturdy and he hadn't suffered any losses in the fight with Bark just now, his confidence was greatly boosted. He inwardly thought that he'd just eaten and his stomach just so happened to be a bit bloated. If they didn't know what was good for them, another fight would help with digestion. At this moment, Han Shor also felt a bit strange. He felt that after coming to the profound continent, his appetite had increased due to his training in demonic yuan. His personality seemed to have become a bit bolder. Not only did he dare to do things that he clearly didn't dare to do in the past, he even had more and more desires for them. These two errand boys were in their 20s and over 1.7 meters tall. They were called Borge and Carey. Over the years, they'd often bullied Brian and Jack by relying on their greater strength. They'd even forcefully pushed some of the tasks that should have been theirs to do to Brian and Jack. For example, the task of cleaning the laboratory should have been theirs. But this is Bark's. I beat him up, so it's mine now. The three errand boys fought wildly at the intersection without any sort of strategy. As they fought, Carey and Borge felt more and more pain all over their bodies, and their strength grew weaker and weaker. Han Shoror's body ached slightly, but he actually felt very comfortable, as if he had an inexhaustible amount of energy. He actually fought more and more freely. In the end, it was actually Han Shoror who chased after Carey and Borge, and then the two of them ran away in defeat. Jack, pointing at his chest, Han Shoror said carkily, because I have a brave heart. The first thing that was needed to refine a demonic treasure was materials. Since he was just experimenting for fun, Han Shoror used the little skull as the main material. The useless blood, bone powder, and lizard tails from the warehouse became the supplementary materials for the demonic treasure. At this moment, little fatty Jack looked at Han Shoror with adoration and tugged at Han Shoror, laughing heartily. Brian, you're so amazing now. You actually beat Carey and Borge away by yourself. How did you do it? Brian, Jack, you two should be cleaning the laboratory at this time. You haven't even finished cleaning the statues yet. If you cause us to be punished, then you two brats are finished. Now that he had Little Skull to help him throw out the trash in the morning, and he didn't have to do much for Carey and Borge, Han Shoror suddenly felt a lot more relaxed. Han Shoror didn't continue to ask Jack to borrow other magic tomes during this time. He obediently studied the foundations of necromancy and prepared to build a solid foundation first. Chapter 8. The next day. Han Shoror was still in a daze and hadn't fully woken up yet. The small door to the warehouse was pushed open with a bang. Little fatty Jack rushed over and shook Han Shoror violently as soon as he entered. After shaking Han Shoror awake, he yelled excitedly, "Wake up, Brian, there's a good show to watch." Han Shoror was still drowsy. He'd just been dreaming that he'd sent Little Skull to beat up Lisa. He hadn't even finished his dream when he was woken up by Jack, who said with dissatisfaction, "It's early in the morning, what's the matter?" Jack's two soybean-sized eyes sparkled with excitement as he laughed heartily. "Brian, I don't know what that Lisa did, but she summoned a very strange little skull. That little skull isn't obedient, and I don't know what's going on, but it's been making a lot of noise in her room this early in the morning." The little skull then ran towards the Light Magic Academy with Lisa chasing after it with all her might. "Oh, I swear, I've never seen a little skull that can run so fast in all my years in Spectre Academy. He even has 7 bone spurs that look like wings." Han Shoror was quite pleased at first when he heard this, but when Jack finished speaking, Han Shoror's expression changed slightly. He suddenly thought of something and looked towards the small bucket. The water within the colorful bucket had turned inky black at some point. The 7 bone spurs and the little skull had all disappeared. It couldn't be, he'd just used the method of refining demonic treasures to refine it yesterday. In his hazy dreams, he seemed to have given Jack the order to teach Lisa a lesson. But didn't this demonic treasure require 36 days to refine? How could this be? Could it be that he'd used the bone spurs as a substitute for the Yin Devil and had run out of magical yuan? At this thought, Han Shoror felt a chill in his heart. He abruptly jumped out of bed. He didn't even care about cleaning the stone statues in the morning. He dragged Jack and ran towards the Light Magic Academy. Han Shoror was anxious as he ran. Han Shoror wasn't a pure necromancy major student and couldn't be as indifferent to his summoned creatures as they were, completely disregarding the life and death of the summoned creature. During this time, Little Skull had been helping Han Shoror throw out the trash, which saved Han Shoror a lot of effort. Han Shoror had unknowingly developed feelings for Little Skull, so he naturally didn't want anything to happen to him. It wasn't just Han Shoror and Jack. Some of the necromancy students also had strange expressions on their faces as they hurried to the School of Light Magic, chattering non-stop along the way. How strange, what a small skeleton. It's black, and there are 7 bone spurs on its back. I really don't know how Lisa managed to summon it. Amy said as she walked. Yes, what's even stranger is that this little skull is running so fast. Oh my gosh, can it be that Lisa's mental strength is stronger than ours, so the skeletal warriors she summons are different from ours? Athena also had a face full of surprise as she made a big fuss as she and Amy sped towards the School of Light Magic. Novice mage Bella's brow furrowed slightly when she heard Athena's words. She snorted, I'm also a novice mage, but I've never summoned such a strange skeleton. What's even stranger is that this little skull doesn't listen to its summoner. This doesn't make sense at all. Han Shoror listened to the conversations of the necromancy students as he ran with Jack. From their words, Han Shoror knew that this little skull of his, which had been refined using the method of refining magical treasures, was extremely unusual. Secretly anxious, Han Shoror tried to contact the little skeleton with his mental strength and discovered that he could contact it. However, he didn't know if it was because the little skeleton had been refined using demonic treasures before, but the little skeleton didn't seem to be able to receive his commands and was still running around in the distance. The School of Light Magic didn't have as few students as the necromancy major. The Light Major was a large major in the Babylon Academy of Magic, and there were many outstanding students within. In addition, the Light Major students had always hated the Dark Major. This might be because light and dark magic were opposites, especially the necromancy major students. The Light Major students loathed them even more, as light magic had a suppressive effect on necromancy magic. Many light magic spells were extremely destructive to the dark creatures summoned by necromancers. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that light magic was the nemesis of the necromancy major. After Han Shoror returned to the necromancy major, he'd learned a great deal of knowledge. He'd learned from the necromancy students that this was common knowledge, and was even more worried for his little skull. Dragging Jack, Han Shoror sprinted all the way. His speed was very fast, and his frail body was even faster than some necromancy students. The necromancy students behind him all jumped in fright, thinking, since when did this idiot's stamina become so good after he'd gone crazy? By the time Han Shoror reached the Light Major students, Jack had already collapsed from exhaustion. He sat on the ground and panted heavily, yelling, Brian, you run so fast. I'm about to die of exhaustion from being dragged by you, but you don't even have a sweat on your head. At this moment, Han Shoror's attention was completely focused on the little skull that was bouncing here and there in the School of Light Magic, and he completely ignored Jack's complaints. In the middle of the magic plaza of the School of Light, a little skull that was as black as ink, with 7 bone spurs sticking out of its back, and a bone knife that looked like a small dagger in its hand that sparkled with a dim light, was scurrying around in the plaza. The black little skull's bones had been refined by Han Shoror, and seemed to shimmer with a faint halo of light. The bone spurs sticking out of its back looked natural and didn't give off any sense of awkwardness, as if they should have been there in the first place. As it ran, its 2 calf bones stretched out like springs, and the 7 bone spurs on its back would flap continuously as it ran. Although they couldn't carry it through the air, they seemed to act as a support, making it very fast. Lisa, who was chasing behind him, couldn't hit it with any of her necromancy spells. There were quite a few light magic students in the plaza of the School of Light, as well as some enormous stone pillars carved with intricate patterns. The little skull darted between the students and the stone pillars with an unspeakably nimble and strange body, leaving Lisa helpless. Han Shoror was a bit taken aback when he saw the little skull suddenly become so nimble. He hastily gathered his mental strength and wanted to order the little skull to return to the warehouse, but the little skull didn't seem to receive Han Shuo's mental commands at all. It continued to dart between the stone pillars and the light magic students, causing the light magic students to yell and run in all directions. The plaza was a scene of chaos. Lisa, your necromancy major has really become more and more unbridled lately. You've actually brought these filthy dark creatures into our school of light. Are you still not convinced of your loss to me last time and want to take this opportunity to show off the power of your skeletal warriors? Novice light mage Irene looked provocatively at Lisa and said coldly. Irene was 17 years old, with short, light green hair and a beautiful fringe on her forehead. Her sky-blue eyes were like two resplendent sapphires, and she wore a sacred light magic robe with a diamond-shaped sapphire embedded in the chest area. The sapphire sparkled with a misty blue light and contrasted with her eyes, making her look even more beautiful. She was also a little beauty. Han Shuo stared at Irene and secretly compared her to Lisa. He discovered that Irene wasn't the slightest bit inferior to Lisa, and her chest was beginning to show signs of plumpness, much more than Lisa's. Irene, I don't need you to meddle in my affairs. Don't think that I'll be afraid of you just because you're from the Camplin family. Lisa temporarily stopped chasing Little Skull and snorted coldly at Irene. TMPH, filthy dark creatures must not be allowed to appear in the sacred school of light. Since you can't take him away, then I'll help you. Irene raised her two hands with a saintly expression and slowly chanted, "O sharp blade of light, transform into a long sword that purifies evil and cleave apart this lowly life." Light sword slash. A long sword made of pure, blinding light appeared after Irene finished her incantation. Under Irene's command, it swiftly charged towards the little skeleton. Han Shuo's little skull had been hiding all this time. When Lisa had stopped just now, Little Skull had also foolishly stopped as well. He didn't seem to be able to react until Irene's light sword slashed at him, and the light sword pierced directly into the skeleton in front of his chest. The dark, ink-colored skeleton seemed to suddenly light up with a faint eerie light the moment the light sword pierced into it. The light sword then disappeared, and a faint puff of black smoke rose from the Little Skull's chest. Little Skull wobbled a bit after being hit, but steadied himself again. He held the little dagger that shone with a cold light and looked around, as if trying to see who had hit him. Phew, this dark creature didn't immediately fall apart after being hit by the holy light of light magic. Yes, this is really strange. Light magic is the bane of dark creatures. His skeleton should have turned to dust under the holy light. What's going on? Could it be that the necromancy major has already researched a way for dark creatures to not be afraid of the holy light of light magic? How is this possible? If this is the case, then aren't the dark creatures of the necromancy major too powerful? Han Shuo looked around and discovered that the surrounding light major students all had shocked expressions on their faces. All of them looked in disbelief at the little skull that was looking around. When dark creatures of the necromancy major were hit by light magic, they would suffer additional damage in addition to their normal attack power. Higher-level dark creatures would begin to rot, and low-level ones like the skeletal warriors should have immediately turned to dust and disappeared. But now, this little skull that Han Shuo had refined with the demonic treasure had subverted the common sense of magic and proved an unimaginable truth to the light and necromancy major students. Cries of surprise continuously rang out from the mouths of the light major students. Even Lisa was dumbfounded, stunned by this valiant little skull. But just as everyone was in shock, the little skull looked around for a long time and finally found who had hit him. Its 5 bony fingers grasped the small bone dagger that glittered with a cold light and rushed towards Irene. 7 bone spurs flapped rapidly as it appeared in front of Irene with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a skeletal warrior. The little bone dagger gripped in its hand and suddenly stabbed towards the panicking Irene. Irene paled in fright as she watched the little skull rush in front of her. She knew that she didn't have time to chant another incantation, so she hastily used all her strength to dodge to the left. Irene suddenly cried out in surprise when she heard a ripping sound. Because Irene had dodged quickly, the little skull's dagger didn't stab her. Instead, it tore open Irene's magic robe from her right shoulder to her chest, revealing her snowy white skin. The little skull still had a small piece of her chest on top of the bone dagger. He stood there in a daze and didn't take advantage of the situation to continue attacking. Damn it, that was beautiful. I'd like to see her use her lightsaber slash and tear open all her clothes, Han Shaw thought to himself in a carefree manner. As soon as this thought came to mind, Han Shaw suddenly felt his mental strength become extremely focused. The little skull's calf bones straightened and its body stood ramrod straight. The bone dagger in its hand flashed with a cold light as it once again rushed towards the flustered and embarrassed Irene who was covering her upper body. It was obvious that it wanted to carry out Han Shaw's order to tear open all her clothes. Now it's receiving an order. This perverted skeleton. Chapter 9. Erin's shirt was slashed open, revealing her snow-white skin. Even a small part of her right breast could be vaguely seen. At this moment, she was so embarrassed and panicked that she couldn't help but scream. That snow-white area attracted the fiery gazes of the male students of the light major. Erin was a beautiful girl to begin with, and she had an awe-inspiring and inviolable aura of holiness about her. This made her even more beautiful. Some of the male students nearby were in the phase where they were most curious about females. Their gazes were all drawn to Erin, and they actually forgot to help her. By the time everyone realized that the little skull was moving again, it was already too late for them to act. The little skull had already drawn close to Erin with the black bone dagger in hand. In order to avoid accidentally hurting Erin with their magic, they didn't dare to act rashly. Erin felt a sense of despair and helplessness when she saw the dark holes in the little skull's eyes. She seemed to have been frightened, and stopped moving. Erin's face was full of grief when the little skull raised the gleaming bone dagger close to her. She hadn't thought that she would be killed by the dark creature she hated the most, and by the weakest of dark creatures, a skeleton warrior at that. It was quite sad. Rip, Erin felt a chill on the right side of her waist. She thought that she had been stabbed, but when she turned her head to look, she discovered that she hadn't been stabbed. However, the magic robe from the right side of her waist to her calf had been slashed open again, revealing even more of her breasts. Her firm and smooth waist and smooth, firm, and beautiful legs were revealed once more after the slash. Even the light green, tight-fitting lace underwear had been torn open from the right side. Erin could already hear the sounds of some of the male students swallowing their saliva, and the female students chattering. To her, it was indeed terrifying to be killed by the little skeleton with a single slash, but to be stripped naked in front of everyone's eyes was worse than death. An ear-piercing shriek came out of Erin's mouth. She covered her lower body with one hand and her upper body with the other as she ran in an extremely disorientated manner. What's with this little skull? Why would it cut Erin's clothes? Don't just stand there, quickly eliminate him. Amidst the heated discussion, the students of the School of Light Magic finally reacted. One by one, they raised their arms, as if they were going to chant an incantation to attack the little skull. After the attack, the little skull stood there in a daze, as if he needed Han Shaw's continuous command before he knew what to do. Seeing the little skull's dumbfounded look, Han Shaw became anxious and did not know what to do. Lisa seemed to be about to say something, but when she saw that Erin's magic robe was torn, she hesitated for a moment and didn't say anything in the end. Damned dark creatures, how dare you attack the beautiful Miss Irene? Accept the punishment of Claude, a mid-ranked knight. At this moment, a figure sprinted over from the distance. Because his speed was too fast, Claude had already appeared next to the little skull by the time he'd finished speaking. Claude's figure dashed agilely towards the little skull as soon as he appeared. His right hand punched out, and a beam of pale green light shot fiercely at the dazed little skull, who was completely unaware of the danger. The little skull was flung into the air involuntarily after receiving the blow, landing with a thud on the ground. Beautiful Miss Irene, I've come a step too late, and I've startled you. Claude bowed courteously to Irene after sending the little skull flying with a punch, speaking humbly. Claude was 18 years old, and his silver hair was tied up and casually draped over his back. He wore a white training robe, and his features were extraordinarily handsome. The female students of the light magic cast furtive glances at him as soon as he appeared, their faces bright red as they whispered to the girls around them. Wow, it's Claude. He's a journeyman knight at 18, and the youngest son of the commander of the Griffin Legion. So strong. Love-struck fool, Claude likes Irene. You're only from a small family, and you're not as beautiful as Irene. He won't take a fancy to you. The female students of the light major nearby discussed in low voices, all of them sneaking furtive glances at Claude as if he were the prince charming of their dreams. The male students, on the other hand, looked at Claude with expressions of hate and fear. Just as the crowd was discussing in low voices, the little skull that had been sent flying by Claude's sword stood up shakily. The dark ribs in front of his chest wobbled along with his short, skinny body. Irene covered her upper and lower body with a bedraggled expression. Her face was bright red, but she breathed a sigh of relief when she saw Claude appear. She was about to speak to Claude when she saw the little skull standing up shakily behind Claude. Irene's pure and holy beauty immediately revealed an expression of panic and disgust. She pointed behind Claude and said frantically, "Claude, destroy that ugly dark creature and I'll eat with you." Claude turned back when he heard Irene's words and made a lighter sound, as if he hadn't thought that the little skull would still be alive. He then smiled brightly and bowed to Irene, "I'm willing to serve you." Claude's aura changed abruptly as he turned around. His previous refined and courteous demeanor faded away, replaced by a fierce light in his eyes. He also punched out with his right hand, and the light green light appeared once again, quickly shooting towards the little skull. Who would have thought that at this moment, a small, skinny figure would suddenly rush out from the left and stand right in front of the little skeleton? The light green light that Claude shot out from his fist landed on the small, skinny figure. With a bang, this thin figure stumbled a few steps back, and suddenly fell with his head facing upwards. "Hey, who's this errand boy? Why did he suddenly rush out?" Surprised voices sounded from the surroundings. "Damn it, Brian. Have you gone mad?" Jack was equally baffled as he cried out with a face full of grief. Lisa was also stunned, her mind a bit sluggishly looking at Han Shoror, who had suddenly rushed out and blocked the blow for the little skull. Something even more unexpected happened. Han Shoror didn't immediately spit up blood and die after being hit by the light green light. Instead, he stood up shakily just like the little skull, with a confused and silly expression on his face and a silly smile on his face. As for the little skull, he suddenly swayed as if he was having a seizure, then suddenly turned around. Before anyone could react, his two calf bones suddenly bent and straightened, and he ran swiftly in the direction of the School of Necromancy with a whoosh. As for the attacker, Claude's body suddenly staggered for some reason and he also fell to the ground. He panted heavily a few times before standing up, as if he'd used too much strength. But when he stood up, Claude's handsome face was full of astonishment and surprise as he looked oddly at the silly Han Shoror. As the person in question, the bewilderment on Han Shoror's face wasn't completely feigned. Claude's light green light had just entered his body through his chest, and in that moment, Han Shoror felt a heart-wrenching pain in his chest. He almost thought that he'd died. It was also in that moment that Han Shoror's mental strength was stimulated, and he once again successfully commanded the little skull to quickly flee. In order to not be detected, Han Shoror even had the little skull flee to the garbage dump to hide. What was most inconceivable to Han Shoror was that Han Shoror felt that the light green light that had entered his body was strangely wrapped up by the magical yuan within Han Shoror's body. It couldn't move at all, and was unable to destroy Han Shoror's internal organs from within. "Brian, what are you doing here?" Lisa finally reacted and couldn't help but call out to Han Shoror. Han Shoror didn't know what was going on within his body at this moment. The magical yuan had wrapped the light green light around his chest, and Han Shoror only felt a slight tightness in his chest. Apart from the pain from before, his body actually didn't suffer any major injuries. But in the eyes of others, Han Shoror was just an idiot who couldn't even hear what others were saying. The blank and silly smile on his face seemed to further solidify his identity as a madman. "Oh, so it's the crazy errand slave of the necromancy major. No wonder he's so reckless. Yes, only an idiot would run into Claude's attack at this time." Little fatty Jack's legs were trembling at this moment, but he still walked towards Han Shoror in the end. He pulled on Han Shuro's arm and dragged him outside, saying repeatedly, "Brian, what are you running around for? It's not fun here. Come, let's go back." "Hold on." Claude suddenly called out at this moment, his eyes fixed firmly on Han Shuro. He didn't care about the little skull's escape for now, but wondered why he felt that his fighting aura had disappeared a bit. What was going on? Was it his imagination? He'd only used fighting aura to punch once. Logically speaking, he shouldn't have felt tired, not to mention that he'd tripped. This was too strange. Could it be that this errand slave knew some evil magic? Impossible, he was just an errand slave. This was too outrageous, he must have made a mistake. "Noble Knight Claude, you wouldn't bicker with an errand slave, would you? And this errand slave is a madman. This doesn't seem to match your noble status, does it?" At this moment, unexpectedly, it was Lisa who spoke up for Han Shuro. Claude bowed to Lisa from afar when he heard Lisa's words, then looked deeply at Han Shuro and nodded. "You can leave now. These two errand slaves can leave, but you, Lisa, you must give me an explanation for summoning such a dirty skeletal warrior and tearing my clothes." Erin had draped a loose white robe over her body at some unknown time. She'd recovered from her panic at this moment and looked coldly at Erin as she spoke. "What does this have to do with me? I didn't summon that strange black little skull at all, otherwise how could I have lost control of him? He snuck into my room in the middle of the night and kicked me twice. I'm also a victim." Lisa snorted lightly and responded coldly as well. "How is this possible? If it wasn't you who summoned him, then who did? It must have been someone from your necromancy major who summoned him. No matter who it is, I'll make him pay," Erin said furiously. Who, Bark? When I was throwing the trash, I saw him run out of Bark's room." Han Shuro had a silly smile on his face as he stammered as if he couldn't express himself clearly, but everyone understood what he meant. "All right, it was him all right. He's definitely trying to get revenge for me beating him up last time." Lisa's face darkened as she said coldly. On the other side, Erin's face was also ashen as she ground her teeth so hard that crunching sounds could be heard. Just as the two of them were about to settle scores with Bark, the school bell suddenly rang. Everyone froze when they heard the bell, and the light mages ran off to the light mages, while the necromancy mages ran off to the dark mages. Only Han Shuro and Jack stood there dumbly. Han Shuro laughed dumbly again and said to Jack, "Bark's done for." Jack nodded heavily and said in complete agreement, "Yes, he's really done for this time." Chapter 10. The students had already gone to class, but Han Shuro and Jack's work for the day had yet to begin. After everyone had left, Han Shuro and Jack also went their separate ways to attend to their own matters. Han Shuro completed his task of cleaning the stone statues and felt the heavy feeling in his chest gradually disappear. Arriving at a secluded area with no one around, Han Shuro unbuttoned the coarse cloth around his chest and saw that there was actually a faint green light leaking out from his chest. It seemed that under the magical Yuan's wrapping, Claude's green fighting aura was gradually leaking out from his chest through this method. Letting out a light breath, Han Shuro's heart began to relax. He thought to himself that the magical Yuan used to train in magical Yuan was indeed miraculous. From the knowledge that Han Shuro had recently obtained, knights were also divided into strict ranks. Every knight had a different rank, and the color of their fighting aura was also different. They were Apprentice Knight, Light Blue, Novice Knight, Dark Blue, Journeyman Knight, Light Green, Advanced Knight, Dark Green, Earth Knight, Milky White, Sky Knight, Silver, and Holy Knight, Golden Yellow. Since Claude's fighting aura was light green, this meant that he truly had the strength of a Journeyman Knight. When a Journeyman Knight used his fighting aura to strike a normal person, it would certainly be a fatal blow. There was absolutely no luck involved. The reason why Claude was able to survive without any serious injuries was obviously because he had trained in magical Yuan. Feeling the magical Yuan tightly wrapping around the light green fighting aura, Han Shuro let out a sigh of relief, but he didn't dare to train in magical Yuan anymore. He was afraid that the magical Yuan would follow his will and flow to other parts of his body. Without the restraint, the light green fighting aura would suddenly explode and damage his internal organs. It was a good thing that as time passed, the magical yuan gradually dissipated in the form of specks of light. This made Han Shuo feel less worried. Because class had already started, no one had come to search for the little skull when he was hiding in the garbage dump. This storm wouldn't end so quickly, and it was broad daylight right now. Han Shuo didn't dare to order the little skull to return to the warehouse, lest he be discovered on the way back. In the afternoon, in the dark major training field, the facilities of the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force were very complete. Every department had their own training field, and the training field was for the students to use to test their magic. There were all kinds of testing equipment inside, such as the divine testing stone for testing mental strength, and magic refining equipment for testing the power of magic. The necromancy major also had a few spacious rooms for students to conduct magic tests. Han Shuo was holding a mop and mopping a few practice fields belonging to the necromancy major when he suddenly saw some necromancy students walking over. Among them was Bark, who hadn't come looking for trouble for a long time. Bark's face was swollen, and he looked miserable. It seemed that Irene and Lisa had already taught him a lesson. Barker's face suddenly turned ashen when he saw Han Shuo mopping the floor. His face, which was already ugly to begin with, became even more distorted. It was almost impossible to make out his original appearance. Han Shuo was secretly pleased with himself as he wore a silly and honest smile on his face. He was even humming some light, indescribable ballad as he gripped the mop in his hand and pulled it here and there in a variety of ways. "Damned Brian, when did you see that black little skull run out from my room?" Barker's face was distorted, and he roared angrily at Han Shuo. With a blank expression, Han Shuo lifted his head to look at Barker and gave him a silly smile. He didn't respond at all as he pulled the mop and quickly walked away. "Don't run, I won't let you go today, Buck. How many times have I told you not to bully Brian? Don't tell me that you dare to disobey me." Fanny walked in from the door and immediately put her hands on her hips when she saw that Barker was about to chase after Han Shuo. "Master Fanny, look at my face. It's all because of Brian's lies that I was beaten up by Lisa and Irene. It's Brian who is bullying me. Oh, I've heard about what happened this morning. Maybe Brian saw things in his days. He's already like this. Why are you still bickering with him? Humph, with your level of magic, you really can't summon the powerful and strange little skull." At this point, Fanny murmured to herself, "Just who summoned it? Master is also very curious. There's a rumor going around that our necromancy major has made a great breakthrough, and that we've discovered a spell that makes dark creatures unafraid of light magic attacks." Han Shuo walked to the corner of the room and looked at the beautiful Fanny from afar. Fanny's long, pale purple hair was coiled into a purple bun today, with only a few strands of messy purple hair left on her forehead. It added a few hints of charm and beauty, and made Han Shuo sigh with admiration in his heart. "Brian, your agony of the soul should be over. You can practice zombies with me today. Come, let's go to training field number 3. The little witch Lisa swept a glance at Han Shuo in the corner and said haughtily, "Lisa, practice is practice, but you can't use the wraith to attack like last time." Fanny was worried that something would happen to Han Shuo when she heard Lisa's words and spoke up to remind her. "Got it, Master Fanny." Lisa responded carelessly and walked towards training field number 3. Helping students practice magic was one of the duties of an errand boy. On the other hand, Han Shuo also wanted to wait for an opportunity for revenge, so he obediently put down the mop and walked towards training field number 3. When Han Shuo entered the training field, he heard a click. Lisa had already closed the door to training field number 3. This meant that she wanted to use it alone. Lisa stood behind the door proudly and stared at Han Shuo. "Let's see where you can run off to today." Lisa immediately raised her hands after saying this and started chanting a magical incantation, "Fallen zombie warrior, answer the call of the Dark Herald and reveal your existence." A zombie warrior with a dark green body and tough muscles appeared in response to incantation's summon. It held a thick wooden stick in its hand. Zombie warriors were a level higher than skeletal warriors. Zombie warriors weren't zombies. Their bodies were tough and sturdy, and their movements were faster and stronger than skeletal warriors. Only novice magicians could summon them. A magician's apprentice like Barker couldn't do anything. These dark creatures could attack the enemy according to the summoner's mental commands. However, these low-level dark creatures were often very unintelligent and could only carry out the simplest attacks. If the summoner wanted to bring out the greatest attack power of the dark creatures, they had to constantly control them with mental strength and make them carry out all sorts of complex attacks according to the summoner's will. However, if one wanted to use mental strength to control the dark creatures to attack the enemy, they had to go through repeated practice before they could find the knack. Therefore, the errand boys of the Necromancy Major had become the targets of this training. All this time, Lisa and the others had only used the errand boys to practice the techniques of controlling skeletal warriors. However, it was obvious that Lisa was up to no good this time that she had summoned a zombie warrior. When Han Shoror saw that Lisa hadn't summoned a skeletal warrior, but an even stronger and higher-level zombie warrior, he couldn't help but be dumbfounded. He'd already cursed Lisa dozens of times in his heart and immediately retreated a few steps with full concentration. Brian, I've seen that you've been running faster recently and that your strength has increased quite a bit. Using a skeletal warrior to practice with you is looking down on you too much. Today, accompany the future Grand Magus Necromancy and practice how to better control zombie warriors. Lisa's beautiful face was flushed red and her bright eyes carried a devilish smile that harbored evil intentions. As she spoke, she had already directed the zombie warrior to rush towards Han Shoror. This zombie warrior held a thick wooden club and ran towards Han Shoror under Lisa's control. Its speed was quite fast and it arrived in front of Han Shoror in an instant. The thick club in its hand smashed down towards Han Shoror's head. This thick club was thicker than Han Shoror's arm and the zombie warrior was extremely strong. If this hit landed, even if Han Shoror didn't die, he would still be half dead. For some reason, when he saw the thick club descending on his head, not only did Han Shoror not feel any fear in his heart, he actually felt a faint bloodthirsty excitement. This kind of feeling was very strange to Han Shoror, as if his body and mind were both thirsting for battle. Suddenly, Han Shoror's eyes narrowed slightly and the stupidity on his face disappeared. Instead, a hint of fierceness appeared in his eyes as he abruptly straightened his left leg and moved a meter to the right. Bam! The zombie warrior's thick club smashed fiercely onto the hard ground where Han Shoror had just stood, emitting a muffled sound. Hey! Lisa, who was controlling the zombie warrior, suddenly cried out in surprise. In that instant, Han Shoror's temperament seemed to have changed greatly, causing Lisa's heart to tremble. Lisa had never seen his expression and eyes like this before, and she immediately let out a soft in that moment of surprise. Lisa then forgot to continue giving orders to the zombie warrior and instead rubbed her eyes somewhat nervously, staring closely at Han Shoror once more. At this moment, Han Shoror's expression was one of stupidity, but he seemed to have an instinctive fear of the zombie warrior as he cowered backwards, dodging to the side. He looked like an idiot no matter how one looked at him. I must have been seeing things just now. This damned Brian, how could he have that kind of aura, that kind of gaze? Lisa thought to herself, then snorted coldly and continued to focus her mental strength, commanding the zombie warrior to chase after Han Shoror. Han Shoror was still being chased back and forth by the zombie warrior, but although he no longer revealed the temperament and eyes that had surprised Lisa, he could always escape from the zombie warrior's club at the most critical moments. This aroused Lisa's competitive spirit and excitement, and she directed the zombie warrior to chase after Han Shoror with all her might. She thought to herself, who would have thought that Brian would run so fast after going crazy, and his body seems to have become much stronger. As the one being chased, Han Shoror didn't know when he'd suddenly developed a strong desire for revenge against Lisa. When this desire for revenge arose, Han Shoror rationally told himself that he shouldn't and that he couldn't. He wanted to firmly suppress it, but for some reason, he just couldn't. Moreover, as the zombie warrior became more and more agile, the speed at which it chased after him also increased. The desire for revenge in Han Shoror's heart also grew stronger and stronger. A demonic practitioner can do as he pleases. A demonic practitioner can do as he pleases. A memory suddenly surged into Han Shoror's mind. In that instant, Han Shuro seemed to understand the true essence of cultivating demonic arts. Then, this a demonic practitioner can do as he pleases seemed to become a voice, constantly floating in Han Shuro's mind. Finally, with a low growl, Han Shuro bent his body and lowered his head. The direction in which he had been dodging suddenly changed, and he swiftly charged in Lisa's direction. Chapter 11. At this moment, Lisa was still putting all of her attention on manipulating the zombie warriors. Han Shuro suddenly changed directions and charged straight at her. Lisa was a bit stunned and then panicked. She hurriedly controlled the zombie warrior to follow Han Shuro, while she gave a soft cry and dodged to the side. Han Shuro was hunched over with his head down, so Lisa couldn't see the expression on his face. However, Han Shuro's frail body had an aura that was as sharp as the edge of a sword as he ran. This aura was completely different from Han Shuro's usual behavior, and was the source of Lisa's panic. Because the zombie warrior was a beat slower, its speed couldn't catch up to Han Shuro. It looked like it wouldn't be able to help Lisa in the short term. Lisa could no longer maintain her previous composure at this moment and ran around with a face full of panic. In this way, a strange scene appeared in the training field. The zombie warrior held a wooden club and chased after Han Shuro, huffing and puffing. Han Shuro didn't say a word and only chased after Lisa with his head down. Lisa was dodging left and right around the training field, even forgetting to join forces with the zombie warrior to deal with Han Shuro alone. "Brian, are you crazy? How dare you chase after me?" Lisa yelled as she ran, her voice a bit frantic. As the pursuer, Han Shuro's mind was muddled at this moment. Only the voice of a demon cultivator can do as he pleases seemed to be repeating in his mind. Han Shuro himself knew that he couldn't get into a big conflict with Lisa at this moment. Otherwise, not only would he be punished by the academy, but he would also be retaliated against by Lisa's family. With Han Shuro's identity as an errand boy, either side would make him suffer. However, logic was logic, and thoughts were thoughts. Even though he knew he shouldn't, Han Shuro seemed to have taken the wrong medicine and chased after Lisa with a death grip. This was truly in line with the saying a demon cultivator can do as he pleases. Suddenly, Lisa gave a soft "ah" and slipped in the middle of running, falling head over heels. At this moment, Han Shuro was about to catch up to Lisa and took advantage of this opportunity to appear next to Lisa with a slight push. "Ah, Brian, what are you doing? If you dare bully me, I'll kill you for sure." Lisa hadn't gotten up yet when she saw that Han Shuro was already standing next to her, raising his left foot and kicking towards her. She couldn't help but threaten him in her panic. Han Shuro had a very strange expression on his face at this moment. His eyebrows were tightly knit together, as if he was hesitating and struggling. Logic didn't allow him to kick Lisa, but when Lisa said "I'll kill you for sure," a trace of violence suddenly flashed across his face. His left foot didn't stop and kicked towards Lisa's round and perky butt. With a bam, the kick landed squarely on its target. Han Shuro felt as if his left foot had kicked a smooth rubber ball, with a soft bounce to it. Lisa, who'd been kicked, unsurprisingly let out a cry of pain like a pig being slaughtered, and cursed Han Shuro incessantly. At the same time, the magical yuan on Han Shuro's chest that had been enveloping Claude's light green fighting aura suddenly began to rapidly circulate like a whirlpool. Han Shuro could clearly feel that as the magical yuan rapidly circulated, Claude's light green fighting aura gradually turned into strands of strange energy that dissolved into the whirlpool. In just a moment, the light green fighting aura that had remained in Han Shuro's body for a day disappeared without a trace within the circulation of the magical yuan. The magical yuan in Han Shuro's body grew noticeably stronger, making Han Shuro feel that the light green fighting aura seemed to have been digested by the magical yuan. At this moment, the magical yuan in Han Shuro's chest once again flowed aimlessly within Han Shuro's body. Han Shuro felt that the physical strength he'd just expended was suddenly restored, and even his mind was at its peak, as if he'd eaten some extremely nourishing elixir. At this moment, Han Shuro seemed to understand the true meaning of the phrase "a demon can do as he pleases." It seemed that as long as he acted according to his heart's desires, the magical yuan would circulate faster, and he would be able to absorb and transform the fighting aura that remained in his body into nourishment for the magical yuan within his body. A demon can do as he pleases, and a demon can harm others to benefit himself. So even cultivation has to be like this. Han Shao thought to himself with a strange expression on his face. Woo, it hurts, damn Brian, I'll definitely kill you, you're hurting me. At Han Shao's feet, the little sorceress Lisa was still yelling threats at Han Shao, clutching her perky little butt. There were faint glimmers of tears in her eyes. It seemed that Han Shao's kick just now had not been light. His contemplation was interrupted by the loud yelling. Han Shao saw Lisa's current appearance and immediately knew that he was in trouble. Han Shao was well aware of Lisa's temper. She was famous for seeking revenge for the smallest grievance. She would definitely not let this matter rest after kicking her this time. Especially since Lisa was already crying. Looking at her appearance, her butt seemed to have suffered quite a bit of damage. If the school found out about this, Han Shao would definitely be finished. At this moment, the zombie warrior finally arrived in front of Han Shao with the wooden club in hand. Under Lisa's control, the club smashed towards Han Shao's head. Looking back, Han Shao was startled to see the wooden club descending towards his head. However, he suddenly felt that the speed of the club's fall seemed to have slowed down. Han Shao's feet moved and he actually easily dodged the attack this time. Hey! Han Shao was a bit surprised. He watched as the club fell again, and he also easily dodged to the side. Then, Han Shao understood that it wasn't that the zombie warrior's movements had slowed down, but rather that his speed and eyesight had improved. Heh, still missed. With a strange laugh, Han Shao set aside his thoughts and continued to dodge the zombie warrior's attacks. Every time he ran, Han Shao could feel that his body was becoming more and more nimble. He actually had the leisure to tease Lisa. The little demoness Lisa had originally controlled the zombie warrior to take revenge for herself, but who would have thought that the despicable Han Shao would suddenly become as nimble as a little monkey, jumping left and right to avoid the zombie warrior's attacks. He even shamelessly opened his mouth to yell again and again, as if mocking her helplessness. Damned Brian, I won't let you get away with this. Lisa saw that the zombie warrior was helpless against Han Shao, and that her butt was sore and her spirit was a bit low. She screamed a threat and immediately sent the zombie warrior back to the other dimension. At the same time, Lisa wanted to get up from the ground, but her butt was kicked by Han Shao. It hurt so much that she cried out in pain as her legs gave out and she once again sat on the ground. After the zombie warrior disappeared, Han Shao no longer felt any pressure. Instead, he smiled foolishly and came to Lisa's side. He even stupidly extended his skinny left hand and said foolishly, I'll take you to the infirmary. That's none of your business, you damned lunatic. Traces of tears were still on Lisa's small face as she felt the pain on her butt. She immediately said fiercely to Han Shao. Han Shao seemed to be a bit dazed when he heard these words, and then a mischievous light burst forth from his eyes. He actually reached out his left hand and suddenly felt Lisa's smooth, perky butt. He said foolishly, then I'll help you rub it. Although this little she-devil Lisa had an exceedingly bad temper, she was indeed a beautiful little girl. Although her breasts weren't fully developed yet, her little butt was abnormally full. Han Shao's heart immediately skipped a beat when he touched it. It felt exceedingly soft and perky, extremely nice to the touch. Ah, Brian, go to hell, don't come near me. There were still traces of tears on Lisa's face when she felt her buttocks being rubbed by Han Shao. She immediately screamed like a madwoman and used all her strength to hit Han Shao's body with all her might. In particular, Lisa's kick landed squarely on Han Shao's ankle. Han Shao lost his balance and fell face to face with Lisa, his left hand still on Lisa's butt. A delicate fragrance seeped into Han Shao's nose. This fragrance came from Lisa, and Han Shao's heart skipped a beat when he smelled it. Lisa's body was soft beneath him, and his left hand was still supported by Lisa's butt. Han Shao could clearly feel Lisa's softness. In that instant, it was as if Lisa had suffered a heavy blow. She stood there dumbly, staring blankly at Han Shao. However, Lisa only stared blankly for a moment before she stopped making a fuss. She suddenly raised her 2 hands high and chanted an incantation with a frosty expression: endless darkness, transform into annihilating bone arrows, destroy with my will. Han Shao was horrified as he knew that this was the starting incantation for the necromancy spell, bone arrow. At such a close distance, Han Shao wouldn't even be able to dodge if the bone arrow were to shoot at him. Who knew if some part of his body would be pierced through by the bone arrow? That wouldn't be a laughing matter. Moreover, Lisa's expression was frosty, and it was obvious that she wasn't joking. She seemed to really want to kill Han Shao. Lightning flashed through his mind. Without waiting for Lisa to finish chanting the incantation, Han Shao immediately stretched out his 2 hands and abruptly pressed down on Lisa's jade-like arms, hugging her tightly. He then abruptly moved his face closer to Lisa and hurriedly opened his mouth to kiss Lisa's rosy little lips. Destroy in front of, woo-woo. Lisa's incantation stopped there, and she finally didn't finish chanting. The 2 kisses met, and a soft, wet feeling drifted into Han Shao's heart. Han Shao's entire body was muddled, and he felt as if he had fallen into the clouds. His entire body was floating, and he didn't know what was going on. Even before he attached himself to Brian, Han Shao had never kissed a woman before. The feeling of kissing only existed in his theoretical imagination. Now that he'd actually done it, he was dazed for the first time. He only felt that this feeling seemed to be even more wonderful than he'd imagined. Lisa's face was crimson red, and her breathing was ragged. Her eyes were dazed, and she was as stupefied as Han Shao. She was completely unaware that she was being violated by Han Shao at this moment. After a while, Lisa suddenly pushed Han Shao away and pointed at Han Shao with a red face. Idiot Brian, why do you always carry so many random things in your pants? Last time it was a rock, this time it's a stick. Han Shao. Chapter 12. Han Shao opened his mouth, but before he had time to speak, Lisa had already launched a flurry of punches at Han Shao. She cursed as she hit him. Damned Brian, you actually kissed me. My first kiss was stolen by a lunatic. Heavens, this is too scary, I'm going to kill you. After kissing Lisa, Han Shao's heart was in a state of panic. It was Lisa's first time, but wasn't it the same for Han Shao as well? Lisa's expression was terrified, and with the injury on her buttocks, her punches had no strength at all. Han Shao didn't feel any pain or itch, so he didn't resist again. His mind raced as he thought of how to get Lisa to stop pursuing this matter. Lisa seemed to be tired after hitting him for a while. Her eyes were a bit red and swollen, but she still stared at Han Shao with an ominous glint in her eyes. After a while, Lisa frowned and said coldly to Han Shao, Brian, I promise to let you go if you tell me one thing. Han Shao stared blankly for a moment before he asked dumbly, Tell you what? Why have you become stronger and stronger recently? You couldn't even dodge the skeletal warriors before, but now even the zombie warriors can't touch you. You even taught that idiot Bark a lesson last time. Claude's fighting aura clearly entered your body this morning. Why didn't you die immediately? What's the reason for all of this? Lisa stared closely at Han Shao as she inquired. Startled, Han Shao cursed inwardly. His body had indeed become stronger due to training in magical yuan, and he hadn't thought that Lisa would detect it so quickly. After thinking quickly for a moment, Han Shao smiled foolishly and said, I don't know either. I just ate something recently that made my body feel stronger and stronger. Han Shao saw Lisa's eyes light up when she heard this. Lisa then approached Han Shao in high spirits, her eyes focused on Han Shao as she said, What did you eat? If you tell me, I won't pursue this matter any further. Mix the lizard-tailed aardwolf tooth with the magic reagent. Soak it in warm water for a day and drink it all together. You'll get better and better stamina. Han Shao frowned and thought for a while before telling Lisa with a silly smile. Lisa's face was solemn as she listened attentively to Han Shao. She repeated Han Shao's words and then muttered to herself, Can it be that these disgusting things have this kind of effect when mixed together? Han Shao didn't answer and just looked at Lisa with a silly smile. Mph, I'll let you go today. I'll find you to practice my magic next time. Lisa thought for a bit and got up from the ground to leave. Then, she let out an ouch and cursed, "Damned Brian, how can you kick me so hard? Why am I so unlucky every time I run into you lately?" Lisa cursed as she rubbed her butt and walked out of the training field. As soon as Lisa opened the door and left the training field, Hanshaw immediately followed and left when no one was paying attention. When night fell and no one was around, Hanshaw snuck to the junkyard and tried to use his mental strength to command Little Skull to come out. Who knew that Little Skull wouldn't receive the command? With no other choice, Hanshaw could only endure the stench and rummage through the junkyard. In the end, he found Little Skull underneath the garbage. Little Skull was paralyzed under the garbage and didn't seem to be breathing, as if he'd fallen asleep. The ribs in his chest seemed to have fallen apart, and he looked like he'd suffered heavy injuries. Based on his connection with Little Skull, Hanshaw knew that Little Skull hadn't been crippled. When he thought about how Little Skull had received his orders to take revenge on Lisa and then looked at Little Skull's pitiful state, he felt a pang of sorrow in his heart. "Claude, oh Claude, just you wait, I'll settle this with you sooner or later." Picking up Little Skull, Hanshaw took advantage of the dark and windy night to sneak back to the junkyard. The broken ribs in front of Little Skull's chest still made clanging sounds as Hanshaw ran. This caused a bout of heartache for Hanshaw. After returning to the junkyard and carefully closing the door, Hanshaw thought for a moment and once again placed Little Skull into the wooden barrel. He then rummaged around and found 7 broken bones, sticking them into the barrel and continuing to infuse magical yuan into it. He once again deployed the Yin magical concentration matrix and attempted to use the method of repairing demonic treasures to repair Little Skull's body. This time, after Hanshaw infused magical yuan into the small wooden barrel, he discovered that his body seemed to feel much better compared to the previous time when he'd been completely drained. It was as if his magical yuan had increased after enveloping and melting Claude's fighting aura in the morning. This caused Hanshaw to have another thought in his mind. After placing Little Skull in place, Hanshaw took out the foundations of necromancy magic from under the small wooden bed and continued to study it. These days, Hanshaw would read the foundations of necromancy magic every time he returned home. Although this book was only a book on the basics of magic and didn't record any powerful necromancy magic, it was still too profound for a novice like Hanshaw who knew nothing about magic. Today, as he flipped through the pages of the magic dictionary and compared it with the foundations of necromancy magic, Hanshaw had unwittingly sunk into infatuation. However, even with the magic dictionary in hand, he still couldn't understand some of the terms within. Sighing deeply, Hanshaw put down the 2 books in his hands. He thought to himself that he had only understood magic for 10 days after all. If he could understand everything in the books, then there would be no need for the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force to exist. After some thought, Hanshaw decided to take advantage of the convenience of his position and eavesdrop in the necromancy mage's classroom. After calming his mind and focusing his mind, Hanshaw once again sank into meditation, making use of all the time to increase his mental strength. He unwittingly meditated until late at night and then fell asleep peacefully. When he woke up early the next morning, Hanshaw was full of energy again, as if there was an inexhaustible amount of energy in his body. The Little Skull in the small wooden tub next to his bed was silent and lifeless. There were 7 small whirlpools around the 7 broken bones in the tub, faintly flowing with a dark light. Upon closer inspection, the few broken ribs in front of the Little Skull's chest had actually been rearranged without him noticing. In addition, there seemed to be a dark light shining in the 2 empty eye sockets of the Little Skull, appearing quite strange. Hanshaw used his mental strength to contact the Little Skull and immediately felt that the Little Skull seemed to be overjoyed at being reborn. Feeling the same, Hanshaw smiled faintly and said to himself, "Little Skull, oh Little Skull, you're lucky to have followed me, Hanshaw. As long as my magical yuan is strong enough, I can continuously refine you and make you stronger and stronger. Sooner or later, that brat Claude will be in big trouble." Because the Little Skull was still being refined in the wooden tub, Hanshaw could only get out of bed himself and throw away yesterday's trash. After washing his face with clear cold water, Hanshaw energetically wiped the stone statues on the road clean. He then completed the tasks that he had to do, received a piece of black bread, grabbed a broom, and ran excitedly to the necromancy classroom. If magic is to be released perfectly, incantations and hand gestures are interconnected. If the incantation is not correct or the hand gesture is not correct, then the magic will not be released. Magic is a mysterious power. Through mental strength and some profound incantations, one can borrow power from the elemental energy of the sky and earth, and then find the target of the magic according to the hand gesture. The necromancy students were either lazily or attentively listening to teacher Jean's lecture. Separated by a few windows, Han Shoror listened attentively, the broom in his hand moving unconsciously. Jean was the same as Fanny. He was an adept necromancy mage and also a necromancy magic teacher. Jean mainly explained the general outlines and foundations of magic, and was also responsible for helping the students explain some difficult points in their studies. Fanny taught the students how to use some auxiliary necromancy magic, and was also responsible for leading the students to practice necromancy magic. In the entire Babylon Academy of Magic and Martial Arts, there were not only adept mags as teachers in other majors, but also archmages who were more knowledgeable and more powerful. However, because there were too few necromancy students, there were also only 2 of them as teachers, and both of them were only adept mags. On one hand, there was no need to invest too many teachers in a small necromancy major. On the other hand, because the necromancy major had declined, there were too few archmages. In the Babylon Academy of Magic and Martial Arts, as long as the students passed through the various trials and became adept mags, they could graduate. Of course, if the students wanted to continue their studies in the academy, they could still stay and study. Because there were more students in many majors, they were divided into classes of magic apprentices, beginner mags, and intermediate mags. However, there were too few necromancy students, so all the students were in the same class. At this moment, Han Shoror was incomparably focused. He lowered his head with a trace of a happy smile on his face. In this short while, Han Shoror had already understood a few things that he had never understood before from Jean's explanation. In this moment, Jean's dull, old-fashioned voice was like the sound of nature in Han Shoror's ears. Han Shoror was completely intoxicated by it. With a plop, a student wearing a magic robe suddenly fell down in front of Han Shoror. He stuck his butt up, his face making intimate contact with the white jade floor. He then crawled up from the ground, grimacing, and turned to look at Han Shoror. He said angrily, "Brian, how dare you use a broom to rub my feet?" I was only sweeping the floor." When Han Shoror saw that it was Fitch who had stood up, he immediately spoke in a panicked voice. Fitch was 176 meters tall. He had light blue hair, a bony body, and a loose magic robe that made him look like a covered stick. He was a journeyman mage in the necromancy major and had always wanted to pass the trial to advance to adept mage. It was a pity that he hadn't passed the trial time and time again. He'd heard that he'd gone to another trial a few days ago and had only just returned. Han Shoror had been so enthralled by Jean's lecture on the foundations of magic that the broom in his hand had swayed unconsciously. It wasn't strange that Fitch had been caught in it. "Hey, it's Fitch who's back. Heh, did you fail the trial again? It looks like you still need to work hard if you want to become an adept mage. Teacher welcomes you back very much. Brian must have done it unintentionally, don't take it to heart." Jean laughed lightly in the classroom and spoke lightly with a mocking tone. However, Han Shoror didn't feel the slightest bit of gratitude when he heard Jean speak up for him. Instead, he cursed Jean in his heart for meddling in other people's business. Fitch's temper wasn't too good to begin with, but it wasn't too bad either. Even though he'd repeatedly failed the adept mage trials, he still had an infatuated love for necromancy magic and had been diligently and tirelessly practicing. Fitch was the boss of Bark and the others, but he normally wouldn't bully the errand boys like Brian. However, both Fitch and Jean were unrequited in love with Fanny. A large part of the reason why Fitch was working hard to advance to adept mage was because of one sentence from Fanny, "I'll only consider it when you become an adept mage." It was precisely because of this that the teacher and student had always disliked each other. If it wasn't for Jean's pleading, Han Shoror might have been able to avoid this calamity. But now that Jean had spoken, it was certain that he'd become a hindrance. Chapter 13. Indeed, Fitch's face darkened as if someone had stepped on it with a dirty shoe as soon as Jean's voice fell. He glared fiercely at the naive Han Shoror and said to Jean, "Master Jean, this audacious errand slave dared trip me, how can I not teach him a lesson?" Fitch rolled up his sleeves as he spoke and took out his grey magic staff, swinging it towards Han Shoror's forehead. Han Shoror breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that Fitch hadn't used magic and was only using the magic staff to hit him. Although Fitch was tall, he didn't have much strength. Han Shoror saw that the blow didn't have much force behind it and directly ignored it. He stood where he was and didn't dodge, only smiling foolishly. Slap. When the magic staff hit Han Shoror's forehead, Han Shoror suddenly felt pain and immediately cried out in agony. He grimaced in pain as he looked at the magic staff in Fitch's hand. He hadn't thought that the seemingly wooden magic staff would be as hard and heavy as iron and stone. Han Shoror only felt his head buzz in that instant as a large, round bump appeared on his forehead. Damn it, why is this magic staff so hard and heavy? I've miscalculated. Han Shoror thought to himself as his head buzzed, and before he could react, he was hit on the forehead again. His head immediately sank and he fainted on the ground. When Han Shoror woke up, he found himself lying on a large, soft bed. The faint smell of medicine permeated the air. He reached out to touch his forehead and found that the two large bumps on his head had already subsided. Some kind of medicine seemed to have been applied on them, and they felt cool and comfortable. "You're awake." A pretty face suddenly moved closer. She had long, lavender, wavy hair, bright eyes, and white teeth. Her sexy red lips breathed a faint fragrance onto Han Shoror's face. "Hey, Master." "Fanny." Han Shoror's heart skipped a beat as he exclaimed softly when he saw the pretty face in front of him. He then straightened his body and sat up on the soft bed, looking around. The room was 20 square meters in size and was surrounded by large cabinets that held all sorts of medicine bottles. There were also some skeletons of magical creatures to the side. The walls were covered in magical patterns and words, and there was a round black stone table in the middle that formed a simple magical matrix. With just a glance, Han Shoror knew that this was Fanny Lab. While Han Shoror was looking around, Fanny was also looking at Han Shoror in surprise. It was only when Han Shoror's head turned around and looked at her that Fanny stretched out her slender finger and lightly touched Han Shoror's forehead. She then exclaimed softly and said in surprise, the swelling has subsided so quickly. There's not even a drop of blood after being hit by such a heavy magic staff. How is this possible?" Han Shoror's heart skipped a beat when he was touched by Fanny's finger. His nose even greedily inhaled deeply, and a trace of a satisfied smile blossomed at the corner of his mouth as he smelled the delicate fragrance that came along with her finger. Han Shoror's behavior gave Fanny quite a fright. Han Shoror's actions just now had a few hints of teasing and wanton, completely different from Brian's usual timid and cowardly behavior. This caused Fanny to be a bit taken aback for a moment, and then sighed in realization. She murmured softly, "I didn't believe them before, but now it looks like Brian is indeed a bit crazy. Who would have thought that an agony of the soul would make him like this?" Sigh. Although Fanny's murmur was exceedingly quiet, Han Shoror just happened to hear it loud and clear. He laughed wryly in his heart, thinking that yet another person had really believed that he was crazy. Suddenly, an expression full of interest appeared on Fanny's pretty face. She said in high spirits, "Brian, the bruise on your forehead healed so quickly and you're completely fine now. Could it be because of the agony of the soul last time? Aya, this is too incredible. I have another topic to research. Necromancy magic is incredible indeed." Han Shoror could only smile wryly at her self-righteousness when he saw Fanny's face full of excitement as she frantically rummaged through the items. Right now, the impression that Han Shoror gave her was that of a crazy person. He naturally couldn't explain that his body's abnormalities were entirely due to practicing magical yuan. Fanny hadn't brought her glasses with her again today. Her slender, supple hands quickly rummaged through the magical items around her. After a while, she held a pale green ball the size of a palm in her hand and walked quickly towards Han Shoror, swaying her hips as she suddenly chanted an incantation. The pale green ball abruptly lit up with a gentle green halo and was pressed against Han Shuor's forehead by her jade hand. Strong magical pulses emanated from within the ball, and the pale green ball imprinted on Han Shuor's forehead was like a magnet, drawing out a trace of mental strength from Han Shuor's brain. The pale green ball suddenly flashed like a broken green light bulb. Oh, this is incredible. Brian, you actually have mental strength in your brain. My goodness, what's going on? Could it be that the agony of the soul magic also has the effect of baptizing ordinary people with mental strength? This is too amazing. Fanny suddenly cried out, shock and astonishment written all over her face. It looked like Han Shuor had mental strength in his brain, and the impact on Fanny wasn't small. I've decided, this will be my research topic in the future. If the agony of the soul doesn't turn people into lunatics, and can still retain mental strength in the body, then wouldn't it be possible for an ordinary person to become a mage? Oh, this is just too amazing. Gurgle gurgle. At this moment, Han Shuor's stomach protested with hunger. The excitement on Fanny's face hadn't faded yet, and she said to Brian in high spirits, "It's getting late, go back and rest. I'll look for you often in the future. I'll discuss this with the school authorities in a while, and will reduce your workload appropriately and increase your meals appropriately until I've successfully researched this topic." Han Shuor couldn't help but feel overjoyed when he heard Fanny's words. He couldn't help but have wicked thoughts as he looked at the alluring Fanny. He thought to himself that luck really couldn't be stopped now that his workload had suddenly been reduced, his meals had increased, and he could even take the opportunity to get close to Fanny. It looked like Fitch's battle had done him a great favor. After leaving Fanny's lab, Han Shuor lifted his head to look at the afterglow in the sky and knew that it was already evening. He rubbed his forehead and discovered that apart from a bit of a slight pain, there were no major issues. He completed the afternoon's mission with great speed and ran into Jack at the bread collection area, panting heavily. Jack revealed a surprised expression when he saw Han Shuor appear and looked oddly at Han Shuor's forehead. He asked suspiciously, "Brian, didn't I hear that you fainted after Fitch hit you with his magic staff? How come there aren't any marks now?" "Master Fanny helped me apply a magic reagent, so the redness naturally faded quickly. Heh. Master Fanny is so beautiful and gentle." Han Shuor laughed heartily as he spoke to Jack. "Brian, this is your food for today." A shout traveled from the canteen window. Han Shuor immediately ran over and received a piece of white bread, a small cup of milk, and a fried egg from the window. "Hey, Mr. Gotha, are you mistaken? Brian's food should be the same as ours, and it should be smaller than my bread." Carey, who'd been beaten up by Han Shuor last time, shook a piece of black bread in his hand and spoke loudly to the fat Gotha who was in charge of distributing the errand boy's meals. Gotha looked coldly at Carey and snorted lightly. "That's right, the school authorities ordered this. From now on, Brian's food will be like this. Take it up with the school authorities if you have any objections." "Mitch, but you're just a little errand boy, you'll be asking for trouble if you say anything." Holding the white bread, milk, and fried egg in his hands, Han Shuor laughed heartily as he looked at Carey and Borge's angry expressions. He purposefully chewed on the bread loudly, and couldn't help but praise, TSK, this white bread tastes different from black bread indeed. Ah, there's even milk and eggs. Oh my gosh, what a happy day. Hey, Brian, let me drink some milk. That milk looks delicious to me." Little fatty Jack licked his lips and looked at Han Shuor with a face full of envy. "There's still half a cup left, take it." Han Shuor generously handed it over to Jack and then pulled Jack away with a wide grin, leaving behind a furious Carey and Borge. When he returned to the warehouse that night, Han Shuor took a look at the little skull and discovered that the little skull was still lying in the small wooden bucket. However, the 7 small whirlpools within the bucket had stopped spinning. One look at Han Shuor and he understood that this was because the magical yuan had been used up. He reached out to condense his magical yuan and reinfused it into the 7 broken bones. Only when the whirlpools appeared around the 7 broken bones did Han Shuor finally stop and go to bed. The yin magical concentrating formation was only one method of refining demonic treasures. Logically speaking, A single infusion of magical yuan should have been able to maintain the formation for 36 days. However, Han Shuo's magical yuan was too weak, and the materials he'd used were all scraped together haphazardly. Therefore, he hadn't been able to achieve the desired results. Sitting on the bed and practicing for a while, Han Shuo felt that the magical yuan within his body had grown quite a bit. A light bulb went off in his head at this moment. Since he had magical yuan in his body, could he practice the offensive demonic yuan that Chu Kanglan had left behind? Han Shuo immediately furrowed his brow and thought hard after the thought occurred to him. He could vaguely sense that there were many demonic cultivation methods in his mind, except that many of these demonic cultivation methods were a bit hazy and indistinct, as if they were separated by a thin, blurry paper that he couldn't immediately pry into clearly. Han Shuo furrowed his brow and painstakingly searched through his memories. He discovered that the memories in his brain seemed to be a complete mess, and he couldn't remember everything. There were only 3 methods that he could completely remember. One was the basic demonic method, the other was the yin magical concentration matrix for refining demonic treasures, and another was the mystical glacial spellfire. The mystical glacial spellfire was a method of utilizing magical yuan. Its power could be continuously increased as one's realm increased. Circulating the spellfire according to a special meridian route, one could produce red and purple magical flames in one's fingers and palm. The red flames were scorching hot and the purple cold. If one's magical yuan was strong enough and his realm reached a high enough level, he could condense the magical yuan into 2 enormous balls of red and purple magical flames in the palms of his hands. They had the attacking power of burning and piercing coldness. After clarifying all this, Han Shuo immediately felt as if he had obtained a treasure. Ignoring the other obstructed memories, he immediately began circulating the magical yuan according to the spellfire and slowly gathered the magical yuan in his right hand. As the magical yuan flowed through the meridians of Han Shuo's right hand, he felt a burning pain. His entire right hand was numb and stiff, and the thin and weak meridians felt as if they had been electrocuted. If he didn't circulate the spellfire according to the spellfire's route, the magical yuan would reach his palm in an instant. However, once the magical yuan circulated according to the spellfire's spellfire, it seemed to encounter layers upon layers of obstacles. Every time it moved forward, it was an unbearable pain. It wasn't until late at night that Han Shuo finally circulated the magical yuan from his shoulder to his wrist. However, his entire arm was already aching and powerless. Han Shuo understood that the mystical glacial spellfire could only be truly used when he circulated all the magical yuan to his palm and fingers. The pain he was experiencing now was due to the process of opening up those tiny meridians and allowing them to adapt to the magical yuan. The prickling pain was unavoidable now, but it would be gone once all the meridians were opened up. Han Shuo's eyelids were twitching due to the extreme fatigue. Remembering that he still had work tomorrow, and that training in magical yuan wasn't something that could be accomplished overnight, he threw himself onto the bed and slept first. Han Shuo had another dream that night. He dreamt that the little skull had obeyed his orders and beat up Fitch, who had hit him on the forehead, to avenge him. Chapter 14. The next day, Han Shuo was woken up by the impact of a heavy garbage bag. Han Shuo, who had been in the midst of a beautiful dream, felt a heavy mountain pressing down on him. He hastily scrambled out of bed and rubbed his eyes to see that there was an extra heavy garbage bag on his bed. He immediately understood that it must have been someone who had thrown the garbage through the small window of the warehouse. As he cursed, he kicked the trash bag off the bed. With a plop sound, the trash bag rolled toward the door. Han Shuo was just about to bury his head and go back to sleep when he thought that someone had thrown a garbage bag at him. This meant that it was definitely getting late. He pushed open the window and looked outside, discovering that the sun was indeed high up in the sky. He immediately sighed to himself that he must have overslept today because he was too tired from practicing demonic magic yesterday. He got up and was about to rush out of the door when he suddenly remembered the dream he had yesterday. In the dream, it seemed that Little Skull had helped him teach Fitch a lesson. Remembering that the dream had come true last time, Han Shuor's heart jumped and he hurriedly looked towards the small wooden barrel. Inside the small wooden tub, the little skeleton's 2 dark hand bone rings were placed on the edge of the wooden tub. Its left leg bone was placed on top of its right leg bone, swinging back and forth, as if it was enjoying a sauna. It looked very carefree and relaxed. Han Shuor couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief when he saw that little skull was still in the barrel. He muttered to himself for a moment, then got up and pushed the barrel under his bed. He used a garbage bag to block the bottom of the bed before opening the door and preparing for a new day of work. "Hey, Brian, why are you only here today?" Jack was wiping the stone statues on the road and greeted Brian with a smile from afar. Han Shuor looked around and saw that there weren't any students passing by on this road. He knew that class must have already started by now. He had woken up late today. "Oh, I was hit twice on the head by Fitch yesterday. My head was groggy, that's why I overslept. Hee hee." Jack suddenly chuckled lightly, taking pleasure in others' misfortune. He then sneakily moved closer to Han Shuor and said in a low voice, "Brian, don't be angry. I heard from the students on the road this morning that Fitch was beaten up by that little skull with 7 wings who appeared last time. His face is swollen now." Han Shuor, it turned out that yesterday's dream was real, but it was different from what he had imagined. This time, the little skull was much faster, and he had already finished his task. No wonder when he saw the little skull in the morning, the little skull's posture was obviously different from last night. "Hey, Brian, why aren't you saying anything? Are you too happy?" "Haha, I think so too." That black little skull is really powerful. After Fitch woke up, I heard that he only saw 7 little wings flapping before he jumped out of the window and escaped without a trace. "Oh. Fitch lives on the 4th floor, it's incredible that he didn't break into pieces." Han Shuor laughed dryly and felt a wave of satisfaction in his heart. He laughed it off and said, "Well done, I wonder who summoned that little skull to help me vent my frustrations. I've been so lucky recently." Nothing unlucky happened to Han Shuor in the following days, and no one came looking for Han Shuor to practice their magic. During these rare days of peace, Han Shuor would arrive outside the necromancy class early in the morning and eavesdrop on Jean's lessons with a broom in hand. Fitch didn't know if it was because he'd been viciously beaten up by the little skull, but he didn't come to class these days. Instead, he eavesdropped on Jean's explanations of magic every day. Han Shuor was suddenly enlightened about many things that he hadn't understood in the past after a few days of eavesdropping. When night fell, Han Shuor first practiced the mystical glacial spellfire and circulated the magical yuan bit by bit to the 5 fingers of his right hand through the mystical glacial spellfire. He felt a burning pain every time, but Han Shuor could already circulate the magical yuan until it was almost near his wrist these days. Han Shuor continued to study the foundations of necromancy as usual and committed some of the parts that he didn't understand to heart. He waited to eavesdrop on Jean's lessons in the morning to see if he'd mentioned it. Now that Han Shuor's meals and treatment had improved, the nutrients in his body had been replenished. Add to that the fact that he was training in magical yuan, Han Shuor's originally frail body had unwittingly started to solidify some of his muscles. His short stature seemed to have grown a bit taller, and his entire demeanor seemed to have changed. The necromancy students took note of Han Shuor's changes and categorized it as a sign that he'd gone mad. No one paid too much attention to Han Shuor, and Han Shuor was happy and at ease. He continued to work and secretly practice magic as usual, happily feeling the changes in his body. "Oh, endless darkness, transform into the bone arrow of destruction. With my will, destroy everything before me, bone arrow." As the incantation was completed, a sharp bone arrow suddenly formed in the air and flew towards a straw doll in front of Han Shuor under his fingers. However, the bone arrow suddenly changed direction midway. Pa! The bone arrow abruptly exploded midway, and from the looks of it, the arrow had deviated by a large margin. It hadn't shot towards the straw doll at all. Shaking his head, Han Shuor sighed lowly. Understanding was one thing, and using it was another. Han Shuor had been practicing this lowest level of bone arrow magic near this tomb during this period of time, but he'd never been able to successfully cast it. Either he couldn't summon it, or the direction was too far off, or the bone arrow would explode midway. Han Shoror understood that repeated practice was necessary in order to successfully cast necromancy magic. Only through repeated practice would one be able to grasp the knack and successfully cast the magic without any mistakes or loopholes. Every night these past few days, Han Shoror would first practice for a period of time, and then take advantage of the dead of night to come to this tomb that had once been abandoned to secretly practice necromancy magic here. Little Skull held 2 bags of trash in his hands, and after throwing them away, he obediently stayed in one of the tombs, motionless. Just as Han Shoror was thinking about his incantation and hand gestures, as well as what went wrong with the use of his mental strength, he suddenly heard the sound of hurried footsteps coming from afar. Han Shoror's heart jumped, and he hurriedly hid in the pile of rocks next to the tomb. This tomb was very wide, and it was very quiet at night. Apart from Han Shoror occasionally coming over to throw away some discarded magical materials, very few people would come here. Of course, Han Shoror didn't want others to discover that he was secretly practicing magic here. Now that he heard the sound of footsteps, he naturally hid immediately. After a while, a tall, blue-haired, middle-aged man suddenly appeared in Han Shoror's line of sight. His clothes were dyed crimson with blood, and he was foaming at the corner of his mouth. He held a broadsword in his hand. His footsteps were unsteady, and his expression was anxious. He stumbled over without a sense of direction, and kept peeking behind him. When he arrived at the place where Han Shoror had been practicing his necromancy magic, his body suddenly trembled, and his footsteps swayed as he fell to the ground. At this moment, he swiftly fished out a grey handbag from his chest, and carelessly poked at the soft ground a few times. He stuffed the handbag into the soil, wiped it flat with his hands, and crawled back up to run forward. "Dylan, where else can you run to?" A kind voice traveled in from the distance as a black light flashed by. A kind, emaciated old man appeared behind the middle-aged man. He wore a kind smile on his face, and wore a gilded magic robe. He held a magic staff embedded with 3 red, yellow, and blue gems in his left hand. One could tell with a glance that it was a very valuable magic staff. A ball of dark green light quickly flew over from the distance after the emaciated, benevolent old mage appeared. When it stopped here, the dark green light suddenly disappeared, and a sturdy, muscular swordsman with a longsword appeared. "Mr. Duke, what should we do with Dylan?" The swordsman stood respectfully next to the mage and asked humbly. The benevolent old mage Duke furrowed his sparse eyebrows and looked at Dylan, who was lying on the ground with blood foaming at the corner of his mouth. He sighed lowly. "Poor Dylan, I'm afraid he can't make it. He shouldn't continue to suffer like this. Eric, help him. Mr. is truly merciful." The swordsman Eric exclaimed with an odd expression. He suddenly rushed towards the still running Dylan like lightning. Han Shoror only saw a ball of dark green light flash through the air before Dylan's back splattered with blood. He finally collapsed to the ground, motionless. Eric put away the long sword in his hand and immediately crouched down to rummage through Dylan's body. His face gradually grew unsightly as he finally stood up and said helplessly to Duke, "Mr. Duke, the item isn't on him. How is this possible?" Duke was startled, and his complexion slightly changed. He waved the magic staff in his hand, and Dylan's corpse suddenly flew in front of Duke. Duke chanted a wind magic incantation, and several sharp wind blades suddenly formed in the air. Su-su, the wind blades danced in the air, and the clothes of Dylan's corpse were torn apart. Han Shoror hid behind the rubble and saw everything clearly. Eric's long sword had blossomed with a dark green light when he'd suddenly flown out just now. It was obvious that he was a senior swordsman. Such a senior swordsman was so respectful to Duke, indicating that Duke's identity or strength was even greater. This was the first time Han Shoror had seen someone kill someone. His heart was in a state of chaos and his heart thumped rapidly. "It really isn't on him," Duke frowned as he muttered to himself. He shook the magic staff in his hand and threw Dylan's naked corpse to the ground like trash. Duke shook the magic staff again and a strong mental strength rippled towards Han Shoror. Han Shoror's body was involuntarily brought flying towards Duke. "Hey!" How did you know I was there? Hanshoro was flustered in his heart and even more so with his mouth. He made a big fuss as he danced in the air. Heh, what a cute and pure young fellow. Judging from your clothes, you seem to be from the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force, am I right? Duke looked at Hanshoro benevolently. As soon as he finished speaking, Hanshoro suddenly fell from the sky and landed on the ground. Yes, I'm an errand boy from the Babylon Academy. I'm here to throw out magical waste. I didn't see anything just now. It's getting late. You guys continue chatting, I'll be heading back first. Hanshoro stood up from the ground and spoke with a face full of innocence. He took 2 unhurried steps in the direction of the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force, then abruptly increased his speed and ran with all his strength. He thought that these 2's strange behavior might be disadvantageous to him, so it was best to leave as soon as possible. This young fellow is quite crafty. Eric, you see him off. Duke laughed softly behind Hanshoro and said benevolently. Hanshoro had already felt a strong gust of air rapidly approaching him as soon as Duke's voice had sounded. Chapter 15. Hanshoro understood in his heart that Eric must be rapidly approaching him with his sword in hand, wanting to kill him just like how he killed Dylan. This was because Hanshoro could feel the killing intent faintly approaching from behind. At this moment, Hanshoro focused his attention for the first time in his life. He didn't know if it was because of the magical yuan he was training in, but the current Hanshoro was not only extremely nimble, even his courage had grown. Otherwise, if it was according to his previous personality, there would only be fear left in his heart, and no other thoughts. At this moment, the magical yuan within Hanshoro's body circulated at a much faster speed than usual. As he ran, he felt that his entire body was filled with inexhaustible strength. Add to that the fact that Hanshoro was extremely familiar with the terrain, he turned left and right as he ran, and actually managed to shake off Eric by a distance. Hey! Eric was startled. He didn't seem to have anticipated that Hanshoro would run so fast. Seeing that not only was Hanshoro running fast, but he was also running in a tricky direction and was gradually disappearing from his line of sight, Eric's face couldn't help but turn cold. The long sword in his hand glowed with a dark green light, and he abruptly picked up a few large rocks along the way. Hanshoro ran further and further away, feeling that this run was very carefree. When he sensed that Eric's aura was getting further and further away, a sense of joy involuntarily arose in his heart. It was at this moment that the sound of something piercing through the air suddenly rang out. Hanshoro only felt his legs being struck heavily a few times. His knees immediately weakened, and he fell flat on his face in the midst of his rapid running. His face intimately came into contact with the soil, and he fell flat on his face. "Young man, my apologies," Eric softly called out apologetically. He raised the long sword in his hand, and a ball of dark green light abruptly lit up in the air, violently stirring towards Hanshoro. His mind was unprecedentedly clear. The magical yuan within Hanshoro's body circulated wildly, and his previously sore and powerless legs no longer hurt. Facing this fatal blow, Hanshoro pressed both his hands and feet to the ground at the same time, and with a ferocious push, he abruptly rolled to the left. Clang! Eric's long sword brought with it a dark green ball of light as it landed on the ground where Hanshoro had been lying, carving out a dozen or so well-proportioned cracks in the hard ground. It was like a chessboard, and each crack was a dozen centimeters deep. If Hanshoro had been there just now, he'd likely have been dismembered. "I really didn't see anything. Don't kill me." Hanshoro dodged the attack and looked at the strange condition of the ground he was lying on earlier. He was immediately frightened out of his wits. He spoke with a bitter face as he hurriedly climbed up, looking like he was going to run away again. "Young man, I didn't expect you to be so agile. But you saw something you shouldn't have seen today. I'm very sorry, but I have to kill you." Eric shrugged and smiled helplessly. He then raised his long sword, and a few head-sized rocks suddenly flew up and fiercely smashed towards Hanshoro. Han Shoror was startled and dodged left and right with trepidation. While Han Shoror was dodging, Eric suddenly appeared behind Han Shoror without a sound and pointed his longsword slightly. A ball of dark green light suddenly fell into Han Shoror's body. In an instant, Han Shoror flew out and once again fell flat on his face. A bone-piercing pain seeped into his spine, and the magical yuan within his body madly converged towards his back, tightly wrapping around the ball of dark green light that had fallen into Han Shoror's body. Phew, why does it feel like I've lost a bit of my fighting aura? That's strange. Could it be that I've been too tired lately? Yes, that must be it. This kid runs quite fast. Good thing I've finally taken care of it. Just as Han Shoror was about to continue running, he suddenly heard Eric mumble to himself. The state of Han Shoror's body just now was exactly the same as when Claude's fighting aura had entered his body. The only difference was that Eric's dark green fighting aura was a bit more powerful, and the magical yuan within Han Shoror's body wasn't able to completely wrap around it. Therefore, right now, Han Shoror's back was a bloody mess, and he looked quite horrifying from the outside. With a thought, Han Shoror held his breath and lay there, not daring to move. However, at this moment, the little skull seemed to have sensed Han Shoror's danger and seemed to be planning to rush over to save him. Perhaps it was due to the excessive pain, but Han Shoror felt that his mental strength was unprecedentedly focused. In a split second, he issued an order for the little skull to stay where he was without moving. The grave that the little skull was in was some distance away from Duke. However, if the little skull climbed out of the grave and rushed over, Duke would definitely notice. Although he didn't know Duke's mage rank, Han Shoror knew from his previous actions that he was very powerful. Naturally, he wasn't willing to let the little skull die in vain. Eric took a few breaths and mumbled a few words to himself. He grabbed Han Shoror from the back of his robe and brought him to a broken grave. Without even checking the condition of Han Shoror's body, he confidently threw Han Shoror into the grave, as if believing that Han Shoror was already dead. Thinking about it, Han Shoror was only an ordinary errand slave. Naturally, he would die without a doubt after taking a blow from a senior swordsman. How could there be any accidents? After throwing Han Shoror into the grave, Eric didn't continue to stay there. He directly went back the way he came. After a while, there was no more movement in the area. Han Shoror's back was in extreme pain. At this time, he cursed Eric and Duke's entire family in his heart. He stayed in the grave and didn't dare to come out immediately. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that Han Shoror endured the pain in his back and slowly climbed out of the grave. Stretching out his hand to touch his back, Han Shoror felt that his back was a little sticky. Looking at the bloodstains on his hand, Han Shoror secretly remembered this hatred. He planned to pay them back one by one in the future. Gritting his teeth, he carefully walked back to the previous place. Along the way, Han Shoror was very sneaky, deeply afraid that the two were still there. It wasn't until after returning to the original place that Han Shoror discovered that even Dylan's body had disappeared. It seemed that they had casually thrown it into a nearby grave. Summoning Little Skull from the grave, Han Shoror cursed and left with Little Skull. In his heart, he cursed at his bad luck. It seemed that he should come here less to practice for the next few days. After walking to a certain place, Han Shoror suddenly stopped. Looking at the ground beneath his feet, Han Shoror suddenly remembered that when Dylan was running, he had fallen here and buried a grey bag under his feet. Duke and Eric seemed to have been searching for something on Dylan's body. Could it be the bag that Dylan had buried? Squatting down with a grin, Han Shoror carefully pushed away the soft soil on the ground and took out the grey bag. It was heavy in his hand, and when he shook it, it made a crisp ding sound. Looking at the style and quality of the bag, it was much better than the one he used. Pulling the string of the bag, Han Shoror reached out and grabbed a few silver and copper coins. I'm rich. I'm rich. Han Shoror knew that silver and copper coins were the currency of this world. Brian had been an errand slave for so many years, yet he had never received even a single copper coin. Looking at the few silver and copper coins in his palm, Han Shoror couldn't help but laugh out loud. Even the pain in his back didn't seem to be that painful anymore. Voila! The contents of the bag all fell to the ground, and a dark green jade box the size of a palm appeared on the ground. The box was heavy and had a cool feeling to it. There was also a groove that seemed to be a keyhole. Next to the dark green jade box, there really was a green key. However, this clearly wasn't the object of Han Shuo's attention. All he saw was Han Shuo's eyes glowing as he stared at the money in front of him. He couldn't help but mutter with a silly smile, "I'm rich. I'm rich. 3 gold, 12 silver, and 56 copper." This was the amount of money in the bag. 1 gold could be exchanged for 100 silver coins, and 1 silver could be exchanged for 100 copper coins. Even though Han Shuo's diet had improved, the bread, milk, and eggs he ate a day didn't even add up to 10 copper coins. If this money was exchanged for food, it would be enough for Han Shuo to eat for a year or two. When Brian was sold to the Babylon Magic Academy by the slave traders, it was only 5 gold coins. This sum of money was equivalent to half of Brian's life. After a moment of joy, Han Shuo put the money back into the bag with a smile. His eyes turned and saw the dark green jade box and the green key. Han Shuo creased his eyebrows. He could tell from Duke and Eric's clothing that they were of high status, especially Duke's magic robe and magic staff. They looked to be priceless items. This amount of money was naturally a large sum to him, but it shouldn't be much to Duke. They definitely wouldn't chase after Dylan for this amount of money, much less kill him. Could it be that it was because of the item in the jade box? When he thought of this, Han Shuo couldn't help but focus his gaze on the dark green jade box that stood silently on the ground. Under the moonlight, the jade box sparkled with a faint green light that was hard to detect unless one looked closely. The hazy green light was very faint, and it appeared to have a kind of bewitching beauty. As Han Shuo silently stared at the jade box, his mental strength was surprisingly concentrated on the jade box. He suddenly felt a cold and sinister presence within the jade box. This presence followed Han Shuo's mental strength and seemed to seep into Han Shuo's bones. Han Shuo couldn't help but shiver and suddenly shut his eyes. This thing is a bit strange. Taking a deep breath and calming his mind, Han Shuo nervously looked left and right. He suddenly put the jade box and the key back into the grey handbag and staggered back to the warehouse. After returning to the warehouse, Han Shuo didn't continue to study the jade box. He didn't touch the money inside either. He hid the handbag under his bed and let Little Skull clean and bandage his back before falling into a deep sleep. Chapter 16. Noon, at the training field of the Necromancy Magic Academy. Han Shuo was sweeping on and off as he thought back to Master Jean's lecture on necromancy magic that morning. His brow was slightly furrowed and he was quite engrossed. A fat figure suddenly rushed in from the door and stopped in front of Han Shuo. Jack was panting heavily as he said urgently, "Brian, it's bad, Carrie and Borge are coming to settle scores with you." Han Shuo was a bit displeased that his thoughts had been interrupted. He frowned and asked when he saw Jack's panicked expression, "What's going on?" "These 2 idiots, Carrie and Borge. I beat them up last time. Why are they looking to die again?" "I don't know, I'm not too sure either. I only heard that they ate something this morning and seem to be in a lot of pain. Their faces are all green and they're shouting that they're coming to settle scores with you. Lisa is also looking for you." Han Shuo felt a bit of pain on his back, but it was much better than last night. The dark green fighting aura on his back was still wrapped up by the magical yuan. The dark green fighting aura seemed to be shrinking and disappearing bit by bit, making Han Shuo feel a bit more at ease. "They're looking to die, don't blame me." Han Shuo snorted coldly and tightened his grip on the broom in his hand, looking towards the door. Jack's expression was still anxious as he rubbed his hands and said urgently, "Brian, things are different this time. Carrie and Borge have found some helpers this time, and they don't seem to be the errand boys of the necromancy major. They're all tall and strong, you better run." "Damned Brian, how dare you plot against us? I'll show you what's coming today." Carrie's voice had already traveled in from outside amidst Jack's urgent urging. A group of people had already blocked the door to the training field by the time his voice had sounded. Carrie's and Borge's faces turned green. As soon as they entered, Borge let out an ooh and suddenly hugged his stomach. His body convulsed and he spat out a mouthful of black liquid. His breath immediately emitted a bitter sour taste. When Carey saw what Borge had vomited out, his already pale face turned even uglier. It seemed that his stomach was also in discomfort. He reached his hand into his throat as if he wanted to vomit something out, but nothing came out. "Brian, what did you make Lisa refine for us to eat? You're the death of us. I'll kill you today." After vomiting for a while, Borge's body was a little weak. He held onto the door with one hand and pointed at Hanshaw with the other and said angrily. Smiling inwardly, Hanshaw couldn't help but be speechless. Last time Lisa had asked him why he'd suddenly become so nimble and strong, he just randomly spouted some nonsense to brush her off. Who would have thought that Lisa would take it seriously and actually brew out those disgusting things? It looked like she'd experimented on Borge and Carey. No wonder the two looked like they were on the verge of death. "No, I didn't." Hanshaw shook his head and said with a blank face, looking quite silly and innocent. "Lisa already told us. How dare you deny it? I won't leave until I teach you a lesson today." Carey shouted angrily and gestured to the helpers beside him. A total of 6 errand boys, including Borge, rolled up their sleeves and walked fiercely towards Hanshaw. Apart from Carey and Borge, the other errand boys were from the Dark Major, but they were a bit different from what Jack had described them to be tall and strong. There were indeed tall ones among the 4, but the tall ones were all skin and bones. There were also some strong ones, but they weren't as tall as Hanshaw. On the whole, the tall ones weren't strong enough, and the strong ones weren't tall enough. Judging from their fighting strength, they probably weren't all that impressive. Clenching his fists, Hanshaw's expression was still naive. There was an irrepressible desire to vent in his heart, and it seemed that he needed to beat all of these people to the ground in order to quell this desire. This desire came abruptly and instantly flooded Hanshaw's mind, urging Hanshaw to act like a spell. Hanshaw's personality had always been rather passive, and he rarely took the initiative to offend anyone. He also didn't dare stir up trouble with too much arrogance. But if he were to fight them now, with Hanshaw's current strength and speed, he might make a big deal out of it. Hanshaw was a bit unwilling, but his rationality couldn't restrain it. This feeling was exactly the same as when he'd wanted to make a move against Lisa last time in the training fields. At that time, Hanshaw had abandoned his rationality and acted according to the desires of his heart. In the end, the fighting aura that Claude had injected into his body had been dissolved by the magical yuan. Now, the situation was exactly the same. The magical yuan on Hanshaw's back was still wrapped in Eric's fighting aura, and the desire in his heart was already extremely strong. Turning around to look at the shivering Jack, Hanshaw no longer had a trace of honesty on his face. His eyes were as sharp as blades, carrying a trace of gambler's fanaticism. Handing the broom in his hand to Jack, Hanshaw said callously, "Take this. Beat whoever dares to hit you." Pausing, Hanshaw pointed at the other sharp end of the broom and said faintly, "Use this sharp corner." Jack was stunned by Hanshaw's current appearance. He stared stupidly at the current Hanshaw, his legs trembling. Hanshaw was now displaying a calm and callous demeanor. There wasn't a trace of Brian's cowardice. Shoving the broom into Jack's hands, Hanshaw turned around. His face was still simple and wooden, and he was instinctively afraid. He said in a panic, Don't hit me. I'm hitting you." The group of 6 swarmed forward and suddenly exerted force with their fists and feet, aiming for Hanshaw's entire body. Clutching his head with both hands, Hanshaw first took a few steps back in fear. When he'd taken 3 steps back and arrived next to Jack, Hanshaw suddenly howled wildly as if he'd been provoked. He charged straight at the 6 like an enraged bull. Carey was at the forefront. Seeing that Hanshaw had gone berserk again, Carey, who'd been beaten up last time, felt his heart tremble. His right foot, which had already been lifted to kick, paused in midair and didn't dare land. However, just because Carey didn't kick over didn't mean that Hanshaw would let him go. Hanshaw could already feel the magical yuan circulating rapidly in his back as he ran. It looked like it was already starting to digest the dark green fighting aura that Eric had left behind, just like last time. At this moment, Han Shao only had one uncontrollable thought in his mind, and that was to beat down all the troublemakers in front of him one by one, dead or alive. Spreading his hands, Han Shao grabbed Carey's right foot in midair with lightning speed and lifted him up. Carey flipped backwards in midair and landed with a plop. He grimaced in pain as his teeth made intimate contact with the ground. Traces of blood had already appeared at the corner of his mouth. The four who'd come to help Carey and Borge were immediately startled when they saw Han Shao's ferocity. Their originally sinister smiles suddenly froze as their expressions became a bit odd. "Don't be afraid, he's just one person. There are 6 of us here, we can beat him to death with a flurry of punches." Borge straightened his neck and suddenly opened his mouth to speak. He pulled out a 4-legged wooden stool from somewhere and threw it at Han Shao with a yell. The other 4 who'd just lost their momentum were all shaken by Borge's words. They slowly pulled out sticks from their waists and followed behind Borge, swinging them at Han Shao's head. They'd even prepared their weapons. Han Shao's eyes narrowed slightly as he saw that Borge's stool was about to smash into him. He suddenly exerted strength in his legs and dodged it. Bam! The stool smashed into the stone floor and its 4 legs swayed wildly with a creak. It looked a bit unsteady. Borge let out a soft "ah" as he missed. A look of astonishment appeared on his face, as if he hadn't expected that Han Shao would be able to dodge it. Bam! Han Shao's fist smashed into the bridge of Borge's nose, causing blood to blossom. Borge threw his head back and staggered 2 steps back. He even loosened his grip on the stool in pain. Han Shao lowered his head and laughed coldly. He grabbed the stool that Borge had dropped and turned to face a short, stocky red-haired ambusher behind him. The wooden stick whooshed through the air. Just as it was about to land on Han Shao's head, the stool was abruptly lifted and forcibly stopped the stick. Grabbing a stool leg with one hand, the magical yuan in Han Shao's back circulated faster and faster. Han Shao could clearly feel the fighting aura that had been wrapped around him disappearing into the magical yuan. Han Shao's hands seemed to have an inexhaustible amount of strength as he grabbed a stool with one hand and abruptly tore it apart. The entire stool was torn in half with a creak. Han Shao grabbed one side with one hand and kicked out with his right foot, hitting the ambusher squarely in the lower abdomen. The ambusher's face immediately turned deathly pale as he crouched down in pain. Han Shao wasn't going to let him off so easily. He was feeling extremely carefree at this moment and only wanted to vent his frustrations. His left and right hands worked at the same time, smashing the stool repeatedly at the ambusher's head and face. Blood instantly burst out from the ambusher's forehead and dyed the stool in Han Shao's hands red. "Stop him. This damned lunatic, he'll kill Alva," Borge cried out in terror as his nose was flattened by Han Shao's punch. 2 streams of blood flowed out of his nostrils like worms. Even Carey struggled to his feet. Although he was a bit terrified, he still raised the wooden club he'd hidden earlier with trembling hands and charged towards Han Shao with the rest of the group. Crack, crack. The sounds of intense collisions rang out incessantly. Jack, who was watching the battle from the sidelines, had his legs bent and trembling as he looked at Han Shao in disbelief. Han Shao was holding onto half of the stool with one hand, completely unfazed by the combined attacks of several people. A bone-piercing chill seeped out of his eyes on his crazed and barbaric face. Han Shao's body kept shifting and dodging, but the stool never stopped. It continued to smash at the noses and faces of those who were surrounding him. In just a short while, all 6 of them had blood bursting out of their faces. At this moment, Jack was completely dumbfounded by Han Shao's callous methods. He never dared to imagine that the cowardly and meek Han Shao would one day have such a ruthless side to him. Just as Jack was in a daze, the fighting aura that Eric had left behind on Han Shao's back was finally being slowly refined by the magical yuan as he fought as he pleased. It was only at this moment that Han Shao was startled. He suddenly realized what he was doing and couldn't help but feel some lingering fear. There are sounds of fighting. What's going on? Let's go to the training field and take a look. Suddenly, Han Shao heard Fanny's voice from afar, followed by the sound of footsteps rapidly approaching. On the other hand, Carey, Borge, and the others were still completely unaware. Each and every one of them was trembling with fear as they looked at Han Shoror with faces full of fear and shock. They all held clubs in their hands, but no one actually dared to take another step closer. Han Shoror knew that this was not a small matter. His mind quickly churned with ideas, and he suddenly ran towards the entrance of the training field. As he ran, Han Shoror carelessly wiped the fresh blood on the stool on his face and forehead, then casually threw away the 2 blood-stained halves of the stool. He grabbed at the wound on his back where Eric had stabbed him yesterday and tore it forcefully. With a pained howl, the wound that hadn't completely scarred split open in an instant, and fresh blood flowed out and dyed his back red. When he reached the entrance, Han Shoror's sprinting speed came to an abrupt halt. He abruptly lay on the ground and struggled to crawl towards the entrance. When he saw Fanny and the others appear, Han Shoror extended his blood-stained hands. His forehead and nose were covered in blood, and he whimpered with a face full of fear, Many of them hit me. Save me. Chapter 17. Fanny panicked when she saw Han Shoror's pitiful appearance. Her long, slender, and beautiful legs moved quickly as she ran towards Han Shoror. "Ah!" Han Shoror screamed and looked at Fanny with a deathly pale face. He stammered in pain, "Master Fanny, you stepped on my hand." Fanny was nearsighted to begin with and ran too fast in her panic. She didn't pay attention to what was beneath her feet at all. Add to that the fact that Han Shoror was lying on the ground with his hands outstretched in order to make it look real, and so it resulted in the current situation where he was being stepped on. Fanny was wearing a pair of tall boots with a long, thin heel. Adding to the fact that Fanny had a burst of momentum as she ran, she stepped on Han Shoror's left hand. The pain on Han Shoror's face wasn't fake at all, it was real pain that seeped into his bones. Han Shoror hadn't suffered any injuries in his fight with Carey and the others, but now that he was stepped on by Fanny, he felt a bone-piercing pain. "Ooh! I'm sorry, Brian, I didn't see your hand reach out so long." Fanny was greatly shocked and hurriedly apologized. She then stepped on Han Shoror's left boot and hastily dodged in her surprise, quickly falling to the right, but the place where her foot landed just happened to be Han Shoror's outstretched right hand. Seeing that the sharp boot was about to harm his right hand, Han Shoror was scared out of his wits. He pulled his right hand back like lightning and wiped the blood off his face. He pointed at the dumbfounded Carey and the others behind him and complained, They hit me." Fanny's face instantly darkened when she heard these words. Although Carey and the others' faces were full of wounds, they had already wiped the blood off their faces when they heard that someone was coming and were afraid of being held accountable. It was just that in their panic, the blood had been smeared on the weapons they had thrown away. They had originally planned to swallow the bitter pill in silence and cover up the matter. Who would have thought that Han Shoror would be so vicious as to frame them after beating them up? Fanny's beautiful eyes were sharp as she stared at Carey and the others. She discovered that although their clothes were disheveled, there were no traces of blood on their faces. There were, however, some traces of blood on the wooden rods in the distance. With just a glance, and then looking down at the blood on Han Shoror's face and back, Fanny had already wisely figured out the matter. Carey and the others had joined forces to beat up Han Shoror, and the blood on the wooden sticks was the evidence. "I will explain this matter to the school authorities. You people can just wait to be punished. So many people bullying a thin and weak Brian, I really feel ashamed for you all." Fanny looked coldly at Carey and the others and said in a sharp voice, "Master Fanny, it's not like this, he was the one who hit us." "Jack, you saw it, don't you think it was Brian who hit us?" Carey was shocked and shouted in panic. On the other side, little fatty Jack's legs were still trembling. He had been shocked by Han Shoror's crazy actions. When he heard Carey's words, Jack glanced at Han Shoror from afar and found that Han Shoror was lying on the ground and was winking at him. Emboldened, Jack puffed out his belly and pointed at the others with his chubby right hand, saying righteously, "Carey, don't lie. I'm not afraid of you now that Master Fanny is here. You people hit Brian and you want me to lie for you? Honest Jack can't do it." Carey and the others wanted to say something, But Fanny snorted coldly and raised her hand to stop them. Stop quibbling and wait to be punished. Turning around, Fanny looked at the miserable Han Shoror and walked up to grab Han Shoror's collar. She helped Han Shoror up and said softly, "Let's go, I'll take care of your injuries first. You're my research subject, you can't get injured so often." As Fanny spoke, the fragrance from her mouth sprayed onto Han Shoror's nose. Han Shoror suddenly felt that the back of his hand that had been stepped on no longer hurt. With his back facing Fanny, Han Shoror gave Jack a look to tell him to hurry up and leave. He then looked at Carey and the others with a silly smile. However, they were first beaten up by Han Shoror and then set up by Han Shoror. Now that they saw the silly smile on Han Shoror's face, they felt that it was the most terrifying and evil smile in the world. 10 minutes later, in Fanny's lab. Apart from Fanny, the little witch, Lisa, also came to Fanny's lab with the excuse that she wanted to ask Fanny some questions. Along the way, Lisa looked at Han Shoror with an odd look in her eyes, making Han Shoror feel that something wasn't quite right. When they arrived at Fanny's lab, Fanny had Han Shoror lie down on the bed and found a bottle of medicine. She was about to help Han Shoror apply it when Lisa laughed lightly and snatched the bottle from Fanny's hands, chuckling, "Master Lisa, you don't have your glasses, let me help him apply the medicine." Fanny didn't mind Lisa's words and nodded, "That's fine. Help him treat his wounds and I'll find some gauze. I don't know where I put it." Fanny muttered to herself as she rummaged around the lab. At this time, Lisa held the medicine bottle in her left hand and dipped a drop in her right hand on Han Shoror's back. She even moved closer to Han Shoror and said in a low voice, "This wound doesn't look like it was just pierced. How come the surface is already scabbing?" Shocked, Han Shoror cursed inwardly. It looked like he had underestimated the strangeness of his body. After training in demonic arts, his recovery rate had increased. The wound that he had received in the early morning had already started to scab, and now Lisa had seen through it. Not making a sound, Han Shoror knew that it was useless to say anything at this time. He might as well play dumb to the end and pretend that he didn't hear what Lisa said. He kept groaning as if his wound was very painful. At this time, an intense pain suddenly came from the wound on his back. Han Shoror immediately cried out in pain and abruptly turned his head to glare at Lisa. When he saw that Lisa's eyes were filled with the smugness of having discovered someone's secret, Han Shoror inwardly cursed that something was wrong. He then laughed foolishly and said the word pain before turning his head away. "Brian, what's going on?" On the other side, Fanny was still rummaging through the gauze when she heard Han Shoror cry out in pain. She couldn't help but ask from afar, "Oh, Master Fanny, I accidentally touched his wound just now." "It's nothing, I'll be more careful this time." "Then be careful," Fanny responded and didn't pay any more attention to the situation on this side. A delicate fragrance seeped into his nostrils, followed by hot breaths by his ears. Lisa said lowly, "Damned Brian, do you think I don't know that you're pretending to be crazy? You scared me by pretending to be dead and then gave me the wrong method of refining medicine. If I hadn't been smart enough to experiment on Carey and Borge, I would have died because of you. I'll tell you the truth, I arrived at the lab before Carey and the others. I saw your conversation with Jack through an evil spirit, including the beating up of Carey afterwards. You've grown up now, you've even learned how to frame people. Not bad, not bad." Lisa continued to apply the medicine on Han Shoror as she spoke. However, it was obvious that Lisa was purposefully messing with Han Shoror and often applied force to Han Shoror's wound. Now that Lisa had seen through Han Shoror's disguise, he was a bit perturbed. He didn't know what Lisa was planning. Although his wound was in great pain, he didn't dare cry out loudly and could only grit his teeth and cry out in a low voice. Her small, fragrant lips moved to Han Shoror's ear and her fragrance wafted into Han Shoror's face. Seeing that Han Shoror wouldn't make a sound, Lisa immediately said viciously, "Damn it, you even kissed me in the training fields last time, and touched that place of mine. I won't let you go. I'll wait for you at the fake mountain behind the school building tonight. You're dead if you don't come." Lisa pressed down hard on Han Shoror's wound again after she'd finished speaking. Seeing that Han Shoror was grimacing in pain and groaning, she giggled delightedly. She then walked in front of Fanny and handed the medicine to Fanny, saying, "Master Fanny, I've already applied the medicine on him. I suddenly remembered that I have something to do and will be leaving first. I'll ask you about the difficult problem tomorrow." "Oh, then go do what you need to do." Fanny responded carelessly and then exclaimed in surprise, "I've finally found it. So it was here." After exclaiming, Fanny held the gauze in her hand and moved her beautiful legs to Han Shore's side. She was about to bandage Han Shore's wound when she moved closer to take a look. She couldn't help but say in confusion, "Why are there signs of scarring on the surface of the skin?" Han Shore's head was tilted towards the bed. He'd been worried about Lisa's actions just now and didn't know how he was going to face her tonight. Now that he heard Fanny's words, his heart jumped again, wondering if even Fanny was suspicious of him. Fanny furrowed her brow and thought for a moment after she'd said this. Her brow then relaxed and she exclaimed in a self-righteous manner, "The swelling on your forehead also quickly subsided when Fitch hit you last time. Don't tell me it's because you were hit by the agony of the undead magic that caused the change? Oh, this is unbelievable." Han Shore had nothing to say to Fanny's self-righteousness. He really didn't know how her brain could be so imaginative, to be able to find a suitable explanation for something so outrageous. Fanny sighed to herself after she'd finished speaking and then started to bandage Han Shore's wound. Her movements were quite gentle, as if she was afraid of hurting Han Shore. Han Shore sighed inwardly that Fanny's technique was indeed much better than Lisa's. He turned his head to thank Fanny when he suddenly saw a tall, thin figure looking at him jealously from the open lab door behind Fanny. The figure only disappeared in front of the door when he discovered Han Shore's gaze. It was Fitch. Chapter 18. Because Han Shore was injured, Fanny didn't plan on tormenting Han Shore any further today. She let Han Shore go after bandaging his wounds and seeing that he was fine. Han Shore felt a bit vaguely vexed along the way. He hadn't thought that Lisa would see through his act so quickly. He'd caused her quite a bit of trouble recently, but she'd thought that he was a bit crazy and hadn't taken it to heart. Now that she knew that he'd been playing tricks on her, she was definitely looking for trouble. He didn't know how Lisa was going to deal with him when he arrived at the back of the school building tonight. Just as Han Shore was frowning and thinking wildly, he'd unknowingly returned to the warehouse where he lived. Just as Han Shore was about to open the door and enter, he discovered that Carey and Borge were cowering in front of the door. These two had been beaten up the worst by Han Shore back in the training fields because they were the main conspirators. Both of them were now badly battered and their faces were a bit deformed. Han Shore's heart raced when he saw the two and he began to size up his surroundings. He wondered how many people were lying in ambush since the two had come so quickly for revenge. Han Shore narrowed his eyes after looking around and stared at the two without saying a word. He slowly walked to the side and came to the washing area. He picked up a hard rock and laughed foolishly. "Do you still want to fight?" Carey and Borge both shuddered when they saw Han Shore bring back a rock. Carey hurriedly said, "Brian, please let us go. We know that it's our fault for offending you in the past. We won't dare do it again, please let us go." Borge was also looking at Han Shore with fear on his face. With trembling hands, he took out 2 silver coins from his pocket and walked timidly to Han Shore. He handed them to Han Shore and pleaded, "Brian, this is our sincerity. Please ask Master Fanny to let us go. Otherwise, the school will expel both of us. Our families are very poor, and we rely on our odd jobs at the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force to earn a few silver coins to survive. Please let us go." So it was begging for mercy. Han Shore casually threw the stone in his hand to the side. The naive look in his eyes faded away. He placed his hands on his shoulders and looked at the two of them leisurely. After a while, Han Shore smiled and said, "I don't want these 2 silver coins." Borge and Carey glanced at each other and then looked at the calm and unruffled Han Shore. They both knelt down on one knee and begged, "Brian, please let us go. We won't dare do it again. Get up and talk, get up and talk." Han Shore hurriedly moved closer to the two and helped them up from the ground with a smile. He then said, "I don't want the silver coins, but I'll ask Master Fanny to let you go if you agree to one condition. I won't make trouble for you in the future. At this point, how could Borge and Carey not know that Hanshoro had been playing the fool all along? Hanshoro's cruel methods in the training fields had intimidated them to the point that they no longer dared to harbor any thoughts of revenge. The current Hanshoro had completely exceeded their imaginations. No matter what condition it is, we'll agree to it, Borge said hurriedly and looked fervently at Hanshoro. Nodding his head, Hanshoro looked at the two unruffled in the midst of chaos and said lightly, in the future, the two of you will be more diligent in helping me with Aaron's missions. As long as you agree, I'll go plead for mercy on Fanny's side. No problem, Brian, don't worry. We know what to do and will definitely complete your missions well. Carey hurriedly agreed, as if afraid that Hanshoro would go back on his word. There were only 4 errand students in the necromancy major. If Carey and Borge were really kicked out by the school authorities and no replacements could be found in a short period of time, then the missions that had originally belonged to the two would inevitably fall to Hanshoro and Jack. In this way, Hanshoro would no longer have any free time. This was naturally something that he didn't want to see. Now that Carey and Borge had agreed to finish Hanshoro's tasks, Hanshoro would have more energy to do other things. What goes around comes around. Brian had always helped the two with a lot of extra work back then. Now that the tables had been turned, it could be said that he was indirectly helping the unlucky Brian take revenge. Seeing that the sky had already darkened, Hanshoro thought that it was almost time for his appointment with Lisa. He couldn't help but say a bit impatiently, all right, I still have to make a trip to the back of the school building. You guys can go back if there's nothing else. Be careful in the future and don't think that I'm crazy and stupid. If you dare reveal what happened today, I'll beat you up until you can't even recognize each other. When Carey and Borge heard Hanshoro's chilling threat, they both hurriedly agreed. Hanshoro's merciless and ruthless methods had already left a deep mark in their hearts last time in the training fields, making it so that they didn't dare harbor any thoughts of revenge. Just as Hanshoro was about to leave, Borge suddenly thought of something and called out to Hanshoro, Brian, when you get to the back of the school building, don't walk through the fake mountain. Lisa just instructed Carey and I to set up 3 traps, including a net and a hole. She said that it's to test the intelligence of the summoned creature, so don't walk in by accident. Hanshoro was stunned and understood after a moment's thought. It looked like Lisa had long since prepared for this. She wasn't testing the summoned creature's intelligence, she'd prepared it specifically for him. Where did you guys set up the traps? Tell me in detail so that I don't really walk in when it's dark. Hanshoro frowned as he spoke to Borge and Carey. How would the two know that Lisa had set up the traps specifically to deal with Hanshoro? Add to that the fact that they had a favor to ask of Hanshoro on one hand and they were truly afraid of Hanshoro on the other. They hurriedly explained the locations of the 3 traps to Hanshoro in great detail. See you tomorrow. Remember to wipe down the stone statues along the way first. I want to sleep in tomorrow. Hanshoro casually instructed the two and walked towards the fake mountain behind the school building as if nothing had happened. At the corner of a fake mountain behind the dark major school building, the little she-devil Lisa hid behind the fake mountain, a trace of a mischievous smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Her eyes sparkled as she looked excitedly at Hanshoro, who was gradually appearing in the distance. That damned Brian, he actually dared to play the fool and play tricks on me. Not only did he scare me by pretending to be a corpse, he kicked my butt in the training field, and even gave me a disgusting refining recipe. See if I don't screw you to death this time. Lisa thought hatefully in her heart as she tightened her grip on the rope in her hand. The other end of the rope was tied in a circle and placed on the path that Hanshoro had to take to reach the fake mountain. As long as Hanshoro's 2 feet stepped into the circle, Lisa would pull with all her might and she would be able to immediately bring Hanshoro down. A large net had long since been spread out from a protruding rock in the sky, waiting for Hanshoro's legs to be bound. Lisa laughed coldly in her heart as she watched Hanshoro walk over in a daze. She only saw Hanshoro look left and right as he slowly walked forward like a thief. He said as he walked, Lisa, where are you? Come out. I'm here. Come over. I have something to say to you. If you don't come, you're dead. Lisa snorted softly from behind the fake mountain. Han Shoror looked left and right as if he didn't know anything and walked towards the trap with the rope. Lisa's heart leapt with joy and she tightened her grip on the rope in her hand with some excitement, waiting attentively for Han Shoror's 2 feet to fall into the trap. Just as one of Han Shoror's 2 feet was about to fall into the trap, he suddenly stopped and yelled out again, "Lisa, where are you hiding?" The trap was just a few inches in front of Han Shoror's feet. Lisa almost couldn't control herself and was about to make a move as she watched Han Shoror about to step into it. However, when she discovered that Han Shoror had suddenly stopped, her heart abruptly trembled in her miscalculation. Just as Lisa relaxed and was about to open her mouth to reply, Han Shoror's body that had just stopped abruptly took 2 quick steps forward and instantly passed through the trap. He walked forward and said in a daze, "Lisa, what the hell are you doing?" In this way, Han Shoror's trap and rope had been easily evaded by Han Shoror's sudden pause and instantaneous movement. A wave of dejection rose in Lisa's heart and she cursed lowly with a huff, inwardly hating Han Shoror's good luck. However, she never would have thought that Han Shoror's heart was actually quite clear. "I'm here, why did you only come now?" Lisa gritted her teeth in anger and revealed her hidden body from behind the fake mountain, grumbling as she stood there. "Oh, nothing, just that my back still hurts a bit so I went back to rest for a bit. Thank you for bandaging my wounds today," Han Shoror said expressionlessly and walked straight towards Lisa. Suddenly, a crunching sound rang out, as if a fragile wooden raft had been stepped on and snapped. Han Shoror's panicked yell was accompanied by his body instantly disappearing from where he had been standing. However, pained groans sounded from a dark hole that had suddenly appeared. "Haha, damned Brian, you've finally fallen for it. See if I don't take care of you properly today. How dare you play the fool and bully the future Grand Magus Necromancer?" Lisa, who just had a dejected expression on her face, couldn't help but be overjoyed when she saw Han Shoror fall into the trap. She immediately yelled excitedly and quickly ran out from behind the fake mountain, walking directly towards the mouth of the trap that Han Shoror had fallen into. Lisa walked to the mouth of the trap with a proud smile, loudly cursing Han Shoror as she took out a rock. She planned on using the rock to smash Han Shoror who had fallen into the trap and take revenge for Han Shoror's recent bullying. Suddenly, Lisa's right ankle was tightly grabbed by a hand. She was frightened out of her wits and looked down, only to discover that Han Shoror's left hand was grabbing the mouth of the trap and his right hand was grabbing her ankle. He hadn't fallen into the trap at all and was currently looking at her with a naughty smile. "Come down." Han Shoror laughed evilly and took advantage of Lisa's moment of panic to pull with his right hand. Lisa, who had spent so much effort to set up the trap, staggered and suddenly fell into the trap as she screamed and flailed her arms and legs with a face full of panic. Chapter 19. In her panic, Lisa's hands clawed wildly and coincidentally caught the bottom of Han Shoror's trousers in midair. She gave it a sudden tug and Han Shoror's body swayed violently, falling down to the bottom of the trap along with Lisa. Han Shoror had taken the time to take a look at the bottom of the trap just now. Using the moonlight, he could see that there weren't any sharp spikes placed at the bottom of the trap, only a few protruding rocks. But even a few protruding rocks would cause one's body great discomfort if one were to fall into it. Han Shoror's heart was surprisingly calm as he listened to Lisa's screams. He didn't know if it was because of his training in magical yuan, but Han Shoror wasn't the first to feel panic whenever danger loomed over him. Instead, he would rapidly think of how to resolve the crisis. This time was no exception. The trap had been hastily set up and was only 3 meters deep, but Han Shoror still had the energy to think of other things in the time it took for a spark to fly. Hearing Lisa's screams, Han Shoror's magical yuan, which had just dissolved the fighting aura, suddenly flowed several times faster than usual. Just as the two were about to fiercely crash into the protruding rock, Han Shoror suddenly reached out and grabbed Lisa in midair, grabbing her by the waist as she screamed in panic. Immediately after, Han Shoror paid the price of sacrificing his back and buttocks to crash into the protruding rock at the bottom of the trap. Ouch! Han Shoror grimaced as he cried out in pain. The wound on his back that had been bandaged not too long ago split open again, fresh blood gushing out in an instant. His buttocks, as the main point of impact, were also in great pain. Lisa hadn't suffered too much injury as she was held in Han Shoror's arms. Hearing Han Shoror's pained moans, Lisa couldn't help but look suspiciously at Han Shoror's body after discovering that she was unharmed. She asked in surprise, "Why did you save me?" Han Shoror's pained cries were cut off by Lisa's question. Suddenly, Han Shoror's face darkened as he shook his head and sighed lowly, "Because I like you." Lisa felt as if she'd been struck by lightning when she heard these words. She immediately stared dumbly at Han Shoror and only reacted after a while. She pointed at Han Shoror and stammered, what did you say?" "I like you, Lisa." Han Shoror looked at Lisa with a face full of sincerity and said sincerely, "I've actually always liked you all these years, so I've been willing to let you experiment on me without complaint or regret. Even when you nearly killed me with the agony of the soul a few days ago, I've never resented you. However, I understand that I'm just an odd-job servant. My status is too different from yours, so I can only bury these thoughts deep in my heart, never daring to reveal them. Then, I'll use some crazy actions to beg for more attention from you. Lisa, am I stupid for doing this? I'm too despicable, I'm too shameless." Han Shoror lied with a face full of sincerity as he sighed inwardly. He didn't know if it was because he'd trained in demonic arts, or because he was evil to begin with, but had slowly revealed himself in this world without too many restrictions. Lisa was completely dumbfounded by Han Shoror and stared dumbly at Han Shoror, forgetting to speak. It wasn't until Lisa's hands moved blindly and touched a bare thigh that she abruptly came to her senses and stood up in a panic. She glanced at Han Shoror and actually blushed for the first time, seeming a bit embarrassed. Han Shoror started and immediately looked down, discovering that his trousers had been torn by Lisa when he'd fallen just now. Apart from his underwear, the lower half of his thigh was completely exposed. Lisa had been sitting on his bare thigh just now. Frantically turning her head away, Lisa's voice was a bit rushed as she shouted, "I don't care if you're telling the truth or not, I won't like you anyways. You're just an errand boy in the necromancy major, I'll never have anything to do with you. I understand, Lisa. I just want to stay in the necromancy major and watch over you from afar. I don't have any other extravagant hopes. Now that I've said the words I've held back for so many years, my heart suddenly feels much more relaxed." Han Shoror's voice was low as he spoke with a face full of sorrow and sincerity. I'm leaving. I'll let bygones be bygones, but don't be delusional. You're just an errand boy, it's impossible for us to be together." Lisa had her back to Han Shoror and hurriedly spoke these words when she heard Han Shoror's sincere confession. She immediately chanted an incantation and summoned a skeletal warrior, having the skeletal warrior throw down the rope she'd prepared to use on Han Shoror. Han Shoror understood in his heart that if a woman knew that a man was secretly in love with her, no matter how much she'd hated this person in the past, she wouldn't lay her hands on someone who was secretly in love with her. Lisa was indeed the same. Lisa wouldn't like Han Shoror because of his words, but she would forgive Han Shoror's previous actions because of Han Shoror's words. She would even help Han Shoror in future matters, because she believed that Han Shoror was silently in love with her. Even if she would never like Han Shoror, she would still be moved and affect her future actions and judgment. Seeing that Lisa was about to leave, Han Shoror revealed a devious smirk with his back to Lisa. Shortly after, he said in a low voice, "Lisa, I can do anything for you. I've tried every possible way to find out that if you want your breasts to develop fully, you must drink more papaya milk, swim more, and massage both sides of your breasts when you shower. It's said that doing this will definitely help your breasts develop well." Damned Brian, who did you hear this from? Lisa held the rope and still didn't turn back to look at Han Shoror. After saying this angrily, she paused and spoke again. "What's papaya milk?" Milk is fine too, 2 cups in the morning and night." Han Shoror suddenly remembered that this world didn't seem to have papaya and couldn't help but hastily explain. Abruptly turning her head, Lisa glared fiercely at Han Shoror and said angrily, "Shut up. You're not allowed to tell anyone about what happened today, and you're not allowed to tell anyone that you like me, or I'll kill you. After saying this, Lisa gave an order to the skeletal warrior above. The skeletal warrior pulled on the rope and pulled Lisa up. Soon after, a series of rustling sounds could be heard, and the surface returned to silence. Exhaling lightly, Hanshaw let out a carefree chuckle. He thought to himself that he really was getting more and more wicked. How could his lies be so smooth and untraceable? Now that Lisa had let him off so easily, it was clear that this method was surprisingly effective. Snickering, Hanshaw walked a few steps and saw that the rope that Lisa had left behind was still there. He reached out and tugged at it, discovering that the other end should be wrapped around the fake mountain. Hanshaw was overjoyed. He understood that Lisa must have lent him a hand in passing before she left. After grabbing the rope and climbing out, Hanshaw swaggered back to his warehouse. Letting the little skull rebandage his back, Hanshaw first practiced his magical yuan. He felt that not only had the magical yuan in his body grown a bit stronger, but it was also circulating a bit faster. After practicing the mystical glacial spellfire for a long time, the magical yuan could already circulate to his wrist. Hanshaw couldn't help but be overjoyed. Could it be that the magical yuan had digested the fighting aura that Eric had injected into his body? Hanshaw furrowed his brow as he thought to himself. He recalled Claude's performance after he'd been injured by Claude's fighting aura. Hanshaw slowly began to suspect that the magical yuan within his body had the ability to absorb fighting aura to strengthen himself. Why would the magical yuan that he was training have such a strange effect? Hanshaw couldn't figure it out after thinking for a while, so he didn't continue thinking about it. He then began to meditate and train his mental strength. As his mind went blank, Hanshaw suddenly felt restless as he was training his mental strength. He couldn't immediately enter a meditative state like he normally would, as if something in his surroundings was disturbing his meditation, as if it was calling him. This feeling was very strange. At first, Hanshaw didn't pay attention to it, but after being repeatedly disturbed in his meditation, he began to pay attention to this feeling. After Hanshaw calmed his mind and sensed, he immediately sensed that the thing that had disturbed his meditation seemed to be coming from under the bed, and there was only the bag that he had gotten from Dylan under the bed. With a thought, Hanshaw reached into the bag and took out the sinister dark green jade box. Feeling the cold air from within the dark green jade box, Hanshaw couldn't help but shiver. He began to carefully examine the green jade box. The thing that had interrupted Hanshaw's meditation was the dark green jade box in front of him. Hanshaw still didn't know what was inside the jade box. Hanshaw hadn't paid much attention to it last time, but now, in order to smoothly meditate, Hanshaw had no choice but to pay attention to this jade box. Picking up the green key, Hanshaw inserted the key into the groove in the jade box. After exerting force left and right, he discovered that he couldn't twist the key. He couldn't help but reveal a puzzled expression. The key couldn't open the jade box. Hanshaw was surprised and began to feel puzzled. Carefully recalling the situation from last time, a thought struck Hanshaw and he slowly focused his mental strength on the jade box. Suddenly, a cold air invaded Hanshaw's mind from within the jade box, causing Hanshaw's head to hurt. Forcefully enduring the pain, Hanshaw's mental strength was unprecedentedly focused. Even the magical yuan within his body circulated much faster than usual. Enduring the invasion of the cold air from within the jade box, Hanshaw tried to twist the key again. With a snap, the key twisted to the right and the jade box suddenly sprang open, revealing the item hidden within. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.